Move to the back now. This seat isn't for people like you. The words cut through the leather-scented air of the pristine Gulfstream G750 like a blade through silk. Captain Trevor McKenzie's voice carried the weight of absolute authority, each syllable dripping with contempt as he loomed over the woman in seat 1A. In exactly 14 minutes, everyone aboard this $85 million aircraft would learn that the woman being humiliated owned not just this plane, but an entire fleet of 23 private jets worth more than most countries' annual budgets. The Christmas Eve blizzard outside Teterboro Airport painted the world in sheets of white, but inside the climate-controlled cabin, the temperature was rising for all the wrong reasons. Snow pelted the windows at 11:47 p.m. as the storm that had grounded commercial flights across the Northeast created the perfect backdrop for what was about to unfold. Diana Rodriguez Blake sat motionless in the cream-colored leather seat, her dark eyes steady as she looked up at the uniformed man towering over her. She wore a charcoal cashmere hoodie that cost more than most people's monthly rent, paired with black leggings and understated sneakers. To Trevor's eyes, she looked like exactly what he expected someone who didn't belong in first class. "Excuse me." Diana's voice was calm, measured, carrying the kind of quiet strength that comes from years of facing down boardrooms full of men who underestimated her. Trevor's jaw tightened. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his captain's uniform pressed to perfection, and his 4 gold stripes caught the cabin's ambient lighting. He had been flying for 25 years, long enough to know his place in the hierarchy. Or so he thought. "You heard me?" Trevor said, his voice growing louder. "The paying customers need their space. The crew rest area is in the back past the galley." The cabin fell silent except for the gentle hum of the engines and the whisper of the air conditioning. Outside, the wind howled across the tarmac, but inside, tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Diana adjusted her position slightly, never breaking eye contact. "I have a confirmed reservation, Captain. I'd prefer to remain where I am." "Preference isn't policy," Trevor shot back. He glanced toward the aircraft's entrance, where he could see headlights cutting through the snow. "The Whitfields are arriving. They paid $75,000 for this flight. They expect privacy." What Trevor didn't know was that Diana's smartwatch had just recorded every word. What he couldn't see was the quiet vibration as notifications began flooding her device. What he failed to recognize was that he had just made the most expensive mistake of his career. Diana's fingers found the edge of her tablet, its screen dark but ready. The aircraft's tail number N127DR meant something to her that Trevor couldn't imagine. The letters and numbers weren't just registration marks. They were her initials and her birthday, December 27th. "I understand your concerns," Diana said softly. "But I'm not moving." Trevor's face flushed red. Behind him, movement stirred in the galley as Carmen Santos, the flight attendant, pretended to organize supplies while watching the confrontation unfold. She was new to this route, called in last minute when the regular crew chief caught the flu, but something about this situation felt wrong. The captain leaned closer to Diana, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Look, miss, I don't know how you got on this manifest, but this isn't a bus. This is a private aircraft for serious people. You need to move. Now." Diana's response was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a promise. "You're going to regret this conversation, Captain." Trevor straightened his laugh, sharp and ugly. "Is that a threat?" "It's a prediction." As the headlights outside grew brighter and voices echoed across the snow-covered tarmac, neither Trevor nor Diana moved. The clock on the cabin's entertainment display showed 11:48 p.m. 13 minutes until everything changed. Diana Rodriguez Blake had learned long ago that the world would judge her before she spoke a single word. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built an empire from nothing and survived every attempt to tear it down. Her mixed African-American and Latina heritage had given her striking features, and an early lesson in navigating spaces where she was often the only person who looked like her. Tonight, exhausted from 36 hours of traveling, she looked nothing like the polished CEO who graced magazine covers and commanded boardrooms across 5 continents. 3 days earlier, she had been in Singapore closing a $4.5 billion acquisition of a semiconductor company. The negotiations had stretched through the night, requiring her to switch between English, Spanish, and Mandarin as she maneuvered through the complex deal. When the final signatures were complete, she had caught the first flight to New York for an emergency board meeting about a hostile takeover attempt. Now slumped in seat 1A of her own aircraft, Diana felt every hour of jet lag in her bones. The hoodie wasn't a fashion choice. It was armor against the world's expectations. The book in her lap, a worn copy of Maya Angelou's poetry, was her attempt to find peace in the chaos of her schedule. Apex Global Industries had grown from Diana's determination to prove wrong every person who had ever told her she didn't belong. 15 years earlier, she had walked into a bank wearing her best suit, carrying a business plan she had worked on for 2 years, and asked for a loan to start her logistics company. The loan officer, a middle-aged white man with kind eyes and an apologetic smile, had looked at her credit score, her projections, and her passionate presentation, then shaken his head. "You seem very bright," he had said, "but your profile doesn't match our lending criteria for this type of venture. Perhaps you should consider something smaller, more appropriate." Diana had walked out of that bank with her head high and a fire in her chest that had never gone out. She maxed out 3 credit cards, sold her car, and moved back in with her mother to save rent money. 18 months later, she landed her first major contract with a Fortune 500 company that needed someone who could navigate the complex shipping requirements between Latin American factories and North American distribution centers. That contract became 2. 2 became 10. 10 became a division. The division became a company. The company became an empire. Apex Global now operated in 47 countries, employed over 85,000 people, and generated more revenue than some small nations. Diana owned manufacturing facilities, shipping lines, pharmaceutical patents, technology platforms, and yes, a fleet of private aircraft that she used to manage her global operations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now sitting in her own plane being told she didn't belong by an employee whose salary she ultimately paid. The crew manifest listed her as D. Blake Guest because she preferred traveling without fanfare when possible. Most of her employees had never seen her in person. Most would never recognize her without the tailored suits and professional styling that marked her public appearances. But exhaustion had its limits. Diana had endured 20-hour flights and coach dismissive comments in 5-star hotels and assumptions about her ability to pay checks at restaurants where she could have bought the building. Tonight on Christmas Eve, flying to spend 3 precious days with her family in Aspen, she had hoped for peace. Instead, she was getting a reminder that success didn't insulate her from the world's oldest prejudices. Diana glanced at her smartwatch, its face displaying not just the time but real-time updates from her company's operations across the globe. Notifications from her security team, her executive assistant, and her board members scrolled past in a steady stream. With a single tap, she could activate emergency protocols that would mobilize resources most people couldn't imagine. For now, she waited. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was let others reveal exactly who they were before deciding how to respond. Diana had learned this lesson in boardrooms and courtrooms, in negotiation sessions and congressional hearings. "Give people enough rope," her mother used to say, "and they'll show you exactly what kind of knots they like to tie." Trevor McKenzie was already tying his knots. Diana was simply documenting each twist for later review. The aircraft belonged to her company's charter division, part of a fleet that serviced clients across North America and Europe. Diana had personally approved the specifications for each plane, chosen the interior designers, and set the service standards that were supposed to ensure every passenger was treated with dignity and respect. Clearly, those standards needed review. Captain Trevor McKenzie had been flying private jets for 25 years, long enough to develop opinions about who belonged in his aircraft and who didn't. At 49, he commanded respect through intimidation and maintained order through fear. His personnel file locked away in Apex Global's Human Resources Department contained 3 separate discrimination complaints that had been settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements and modest payouts. Trevor had learned to be more careful with his words over the years, but not with his attitudes. He had perfected the art of making undesirable passengers uncomfortable without saying anything legally actionable. A pointed look, a delay in service, a suggestion about more appropriate seating arrangements. Most people got the message and complied. Diana Rodriguez Blake was proving to be a problem. In the cockpit, co-pilot, Jake Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Trevor's voice carried through the cabin. Jake was 35, a former Air Force pilot who had joined the private aviation industry to pay off student loans and support his growing family. He was good at his job and careful to stay out of workplace politics, but Trevor's behavior toward the passenger in 1A was making his stomach churn. Jake had heard Trevor's comments about passengers before, coded language about appropriate clientele and maintaining standards. Jake had always assumed Trevor was just old-fashioned and particular about protocol. Tonight, listening to the exchange in the cabin, Jake was beginning to understand that Trevor's standards had nothing to do with safety or service quality. Jake's tablet displayed the passenger manifest. The flight was registered as a charter to the Whitfield family, but there were additional passengers listed. One caught his attention, D. Blake guest. The notation indicated VIP status, but Jake had no additional information about who D. Blake might be or why she warranted special designation. What Jake did know was that his captain was creating a situation that felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with aviation safety. In the galley, Carmen Santos tried to focus on her pre-flight checklist while keeping one ear on the conversation unfolding in the main cabin. Carmen was 24, a recent graduate of a hospitality management program who had been thrilled to land a position with Apex Global's charter division. The pay was excellent. The benefits were comprehensive, and the opportunity to work with high-profile clientele seemed like a launching pad for her career. This was only her 3rd flight as primary attendant, and everything was going wrong. Carmen had arrived at the aircraft an hour early to familiarize herself with the specific amenities and passenger preferences. When she reviewed the manifest, she had researched the Whitfield family to ensure she understood their expectations. What she discovered made her nervous. Miranda Whitfield had a reputation for being difficult, demanding, and dismissive of service staff. Online reviews from hotels and restaurants painted a picture of someone who treated workers as barely human. But it was the additional passenger that had caught Carmen's attention. D. Blake listed as a VIP guest with specific accommodation requests that included privacy preferences and dietary restrictions that suggested cultural awareness and sophistication. Carmen had searched company databases for additional information, but found only basic contact details and a note that all interactions should be handled with exceptional discretion. When Diana had boarded an hour earlier, Carmen had recognized her immediately. Not from the company databases, but from magazine covers and news articles. Carmen had done a college research project on successful women entrepreneurs, and Diana Rodriguez Blake had been featured prominently in her presentation. Carmen knew exactly who was sitting in seat 1A, and she knew that Captain McKenzie was making the mistake of his life. The challenge was what to do about it. Carmen was new low on the company hierarchy, and terrified of losing a job that represented her first real step into a professional career. Speaking up for a passenger against a captain's orders could end her employment before she had established herself in the industry. But staying silent while watching someone get mistreated felt impossible. Carmen glanced toward the main cabin where Trevor continued to loom over Diana like a storm cloud building pressure. Diana's posture remained relaxed, but Carmen could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held her book, the measured breathing that suggested someone working to maintain composure. Outside, headlights swept across the tarmac as a black SUV approached the aircraft. The Whitfield family had arrived, and Carmen knew the situation was about to get much worse. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor, emergency crew, change for morning shift. Need to know if you can extend to cover return flight tomorrow. Extra pay authorized. Carmen typed back quickly. Will confirm after current departure. Monitoring developing situation. What she wanted to type was, send backup. Captain is creating legal liability. What she actually sent was professional confirmation that revealed nothing about the storm building inside the aircraft. Through the galley window, Carmen watched two figures exit the SUV. Even through the snow and darkness, Miranda Whitfield's dramatic gestures were visible as she complained about the weather, the delay, and the inconvenience of traveling on Christmas Eve. Carmen knew that in less than 5 minutes, the tension in the cabin would explode into something none of them could contain. She also knew that whatever happened next would define not just her career, but her character. I said move. Now. Trevor's voice had shed any pretense of professionalism. He planted his feet shoulder-width apart and crossed his arms, the universal posture of a man who expected immediate compliance with his authority. Diana looked up from her book, her expression unchanged. Captain, I understand you have concerns about passenger arrangements. However, I have confirmed reservation details and I don't intend to relocate. Confirmed by who Trevor demanded. I didn't authorize any additional VIP passengers for this charter. The Whitfields paid for exclusive use of this aircraft. Check your systems again, Diana said quietly. Trevor pulled out his tablet and scrolled through the flight manifest with exaggerated frustration. His finger jabbed at the screen as he located Diana's entry. D. Blake guest. No payment information. No authorization code. This looks like a clerical error that somehow slipped through scheduling. Diana's smartwatch vibrated again. This time the notification showed a text message from David Park, her Vice President of Operations Ground Team standing by at Aspen. Unusual communication patterns detected from Flight N11927DR. Do you need assistance? With a subtle gesture, Diana tapped out a response on her watch monitoring situation. Monitoring. Maintain readiness. Trevor noticed the interaction with the device and his expression darkened further. Company policy prohibits unauthorized electronic communications during active flight operations. You need to power down that device immediately. We haven't begun taxi procedures yet, Diana pointed out. Electronic device restrictions don't apply until we're active on the runway. I make those determinations on my aircraft, Trevor snapped. Your aircraft. Diana's voice remained calm, but something in her tone suggested depths that Trevor was too arrogant to recognize. Interesting choice of words. Behind Trevor, Jake Morrison appeared in the cabin doorway. His face was pale as he looked between his captain and the passenger. Trevor, we've got ground control asking about our departure delay. Weather window is closing fast. We need to get clearance now or we'll be grounded until morning. Trevor waved him off dismissively. Handle it. I'm dealing with a passenger situation that needs resolution before we can depart. Jake hesitated. Maybe I should call dispatch for clarification on the passenger manifest, I said. Handle it, Trevor barked. I don't need backup from dispatch to manage my own cabin. Jake retreated, but Diana caught his eye for a brief moment. She saw concern there and perhaps recognition that something was wrong with this entire situation. Outside, the sound of footsteps on the aircraft's stairs announced the arrival of the Whitfields. Trevor's demeanor immediately shifted his shoulders, straightening as he prepared to greet the paying customers. Ma'am, he said to Diana, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You have exactly 30 seconds to relocate to appropriate seating before our charter guests board. I won't ask again. Diana closed her book and placed it carefully on the small table beside her seat. For the first time since Trevor had approached her, she stood up her full height, bringing her eye level with his chest. When she spoke, her voice carried across the cabin with crystal clarity. Captain McKenzie, I want to be absolutely certain I understand your position. You're demanding that I move to a different seat based on your assumption that I don't belong in first class. Is that correct? Trevor's jaw worked as he processed the question. Something about the way she phrased it made him hesitate, as if he sensed a trap but couldn't identify where it might be hidden. This is about appropriate passenger arrangements and charter exclusivity, he said carefully. I see. And your determination about appropriate arrangements is based on what specific criteria? The footsteps on the stairs grew louder. Trevor could hear Miranda Whitfield's voice complaining about the cold as she climbed toward the cabin entrance. He was running out of time to resolve this situation before the paying customers witnessed it. Look, he said, his voice sharp with frustration. I don't have time for games. You're obviously not the type of passenger who typically flies in our first-class section. The Whitfields have certain expectations about exclusivity and service quality. Moving you to coach seating solves everyone's problems. Diana tilted her head slightly. Not the type of passenger. You know what I mean. Actually, I don't. Could you clarify what type of passenger you think I am? Trevor's face reddened as he realized Diana was maneuvering him into saying something explicit. But his arrogance and frustration overrode his caution. Fine, he said, his voice rising. People like you are used to different service standards. You'll be more comfortable in the back with appropriate accommodations. This level of service isn't something you'd understand or appreciate anyway. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Trevor had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and Diana's slight nod suggested she had been waiting for exactly this moment. Thank you for clarifying your position, Captain Diana said. I want to be sure I understood correctly. Could you repeat that last part about people like me? Before Trevor could respond, Miranda Whitfield's voice echoed from the aircraft entrance. Hello, where is everyone? This plane is absolutely freezing. Diana resumed her seat and picked up her book. I'll wait here while you attend to your other passengers. We can continue this conversation afterward. Trevor stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing through options that were rapidly disappearing. Behind him, the sound of expensive luggage and entitled complaints grew closer. This isn't over, he muttered. Diana looked up from her book one final time. Captain, I couldn't agree more. Miranda Whitfield entered the cabin like she was making a grand entrance at a charity gala, despite her audience consisting of only a pilot, a flight attendant, and a woman reading quietly in seat 1A. Her white fur coat looked like it had cost the lives of several Arctic foxes, and the red velvet tracksuit underneath was tight enough to restrict circulation. She moved with the calculated precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of commanding attention. Brocky darling. Miranda cooed, addressing Trevor with the kind of familiarity that suggested she considered him part of the service staff. Tell me you have that divine champagne chilled. My nerves are absolutely shattered from this weather. Behind her, Derek Whitfield trudged up the stairs carrying enough luggage for a month-long expedition. He was an investment banker from Connecticut, perpetually tired from managing Miranda's endless demands and social climbing ambitions. At 31, Derek looked older, worn down by his fiancée's energy and his own mounting financial pressures. The $75,000 charter represented a significant stretch of his resources, but Miranda had insisted that flying commercial on Christmas Eve was beneath their status. Trevor's entire demeanor transformed as he greeted the paying customers. Gone was the aggressive authority he had displayed with Diana. In its place appeared the smooth professionalism of a service provider working for a generous tip. Miss Vanderwall, Mr. Whitfield, Trevor said, using Miranda's maiden name as she preferred in professional settings. Welcome aboard. We're ready for immediate departure once we complete our final passenger arrangements. Miranda's eyes swept the cabin and immediately locked onto Diana, still seated in 1A with her book open. Miranda's expression shifted from social pleasantness to sharp irritation in a heartbeat. "Excuse me, Miranda," said her voice carrying the entitled edge of someone unaccustomed to having her expectations challenged. "Why is there someone in our seats? We paid for complete privacy on this flight." Trevor straightened, sensing an opportunity to resolve his earlier confrontation with full justification. "There was a clerical error in passenger manifesting. I was just addressing the situation with the individual in question." Derek set down the luggage with a heavy sigh and looked around the cabin. "This is unacceptable. We specifically chartered this aircraft for exclusive use. We have important meetings in Aspen that require confidential preparation. Who authorized additional passengers?" "No one authorized this," Trevor said, his confidence building as he felt the backing of the paying customers. "This appears to be a scheduling mistake that I'm correcting now." Miranda approached Diana's seat with the kind of predatory smile that wealthy women perfected when confronting service workers they intended to demolish. "I'm sorry, but there's been a misunderstanding. This is a private charter flight and you'll need to make other arrangements." Diana looked up from her book calmly. "I have confirmed reservations for this flight. There are 14 seats on this aircraft. I believe there's sufficient space for all passengers." "It's not about space," Miranda snapped, her voice rising. "It's about what we paid for. Derek and I specifically chartered this plane for privacy. We can't conduct business with random passengers listening to every conversation." Derek nodded vigorously, emboldened by his fiancée's aggression. "Exactly. This is a private aircraft for serious business. We can't have unauthorized individuals present during confidential discussions." Trevor sensed his moment and stepped forward. "Miss Blake, as I explained earlier, the crew rest area in the back provides comfortable seating that would be more appropriate for your travel needs. The Whitfields have priority seating arrangements in the first-class section." "More appropriate." Diana's voice remained level, but something in her tone suggested a warning. "What makes you think the crew rest area would be more appropriate for me?" Miranda laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the cabin like breaking glass. "Oh, come on. Look around. This isn't exactly your typical travel environment, is it? I'm sure you'd be more comfortable somewhere that matches your usual experience level." The words landed like physical blows. Carmen Santos, still pretending to organize supplies in the galley, felt her stomach turn at the casual cruelty in Miranda's voice. She glanced toward the cockpit where Jake Morrison was pointedly staring at his pre-flight checklist while his jaw muscles worked in barely controlled anger. "My usual experience level," Diana repeated, closing her book completely and giving Miranda her full attention. Derek jumped in, apparently feeling that subtlety wasn't getting the message across clearly enough. "What Miranda means is that this level of service and these accommodations represent a significant financial investment. People who can afford private charter flights typically understand certain expectations about exclusivity and service standards." "I see," Diana said. "And you've determined that I don't understand these expectations based on what specific indicators?" The question hung in the air as Miranda and Derek exchanged glances. They were being asked to articulate what they had assumed would remain unspoken, and neither was comfortable with making their prejudices explicit. Trevor stepped in, apparently deciding that being direct was better than dancing around implications. "Miss Blake, let's be practical about this situation. The Whitfields have paid premium rates for exclusive charter service. They have legitimate expectations about privacy and service quality that need to be respected. Moving to alternative seating arrangements serves everyone's interests." "Alternative seating," Diana mused. "Such as the crew rest area, as I mentioned. Or, if you prefer, there's a jump seat available in the cockpit area." Miranda's eyes lit up with malicious satisfaction. "The crew area sounds perfect. Much more suitable, really." Derek nodded eagerly. "Exactly. Problem solved. Everyone gets what they need." Diana stood up slowly, her full height and presence filling the space in a way that made the cabin suddenly feel smaller. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet intensity that seemed to draw all the oxygen out of the room. "Let me understand this correctly. You want me to move to the crew rest area because you believe I'm not the type of person who belongs in first class. Is that an accurate summary of your position? The cabin fell silent except for the wind outside and the quiet hum of the aircraft's systems. Carmen found herself holding her breath as she watched the confrontation unfold. Jake Morrison appeared in the cockpit doorway, his face grim as he took in the scene. Trevor Miranda and Derek all seemed to realize simultaneously that they were being asked to either back down or make their discrimination explicit. The moment stretched like a wire under tension, ready to snap in either direction. Miranda, true to her character, chose to double down. Fine. Yes. This is a private charter for people who can afford private charter rates and understand private charter expectations. You clearly don't fit that category, and we shouldn't have to share our space with someone who doesn't belong here. The words hit the cabin like a slap across the face. Derek's eyes widened slightly as if he hadn't expected Miranda to be quite so blunt. Trevor nodded approvingly, apparently satisfied that the paying customer had articulated what he hadn't wanted to say directly. Diana's response was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a promise. Thank you for clarifying your position so clearly. I want to make sure I have a complete record of this conversation. That was when Miranda noticed the small device Diana had placed on her table, its recording light blinking steadily in the cabin's soft lighting. Are you recording this? Miranda's voice spiked with indignation as she spotted the device on Diana's table. You can't record private conversations without consent. That's illegal. Diana's fingers moved calmly to her smartwatch, making additional inputs that sent encrypted data streams to servers in 3 different countries. This is a commercial aircraft operated under federal aviation regulations. Passenger safety conversations are routinely documented. I'm simply ensuring accurate records of all crew interactions. Trevor stepped forward aggressively, his face darkening with anger. Company policy strictly prohibits unauthorized recording of crew operations. You need to turn that off immediately and surrender the device for security screening. Actually, Jake Morrison's voice cut across the cabin from the cockpit doorway, FAA regulations 135.12 through 135.1. Specifically, allow passenger documentation of crew interactions related to safety and service complaints. She's within her rights to record. Trevor spun around to face his co-pilot fury written across his features. Stay in the cockpit and focus on your pre-flight procedures. I'm handling cabin management. Jake didn't move. Captain, I need to advise you that we have regulatory obligations regarding passenger treatment that supersede charter exclusivity agreements. Get back to your station, Trevor barked. Now! As Jake reluctantly retreated, Derek pulled out his phone and pointed it toward Diana. Fine. If she can record, so can I. I want documentation that this passenger is disrupting our chartered flight and refusing to comply with crew instructions. Carmen Santos watched the situation spiral out of control as phones and recording devices multiplied throughout the cabin. She knew that in her training they had covered de-escalation techniques for passenger conflicts, but nothing in her coursework had prepared her for this level of hostility and open discrimination. Miranda moved closer to Diana's seat, her voice rising with each word. I don't care what recording rights you think you have. This is our plane for the next 3 hours and we paid for privacy. You're going to move to the back, or we're going to have you removed from the aircraft entirely. Your plane. Diana's eyebrows rose slightly. Interesting claim. What specific ownership documentation do you have for this aircraft? Derek jumped in, apparently feeling that establishing dominance required displays of financial superiority. We paid $75,000 for this charter. That gives us full discretionary control over passenger arrangements and service priorities. I see. And you believe that your charter payment gives you authority over other passengers' seating assignments? Absolutely, Miranda snapped. This isn't a bus. This is premium aviation service for premium customers. You're obviously not a premium customer, so you need to accept appropriate accommodations. Trevor nodded, approvingly emboldened by the Whitfields' aggressive support. Miss Blake, the crew rest area includes comfortable seating and access to basic refreshment services. It's a perfectly adequate alternative that respects the charter exclusivity that the Whitfields have purchased. Basic refreshment services, Diana repeated. What specific refreshments are considered appropriate for someone like me? Carmen couldn't stay silent any longer. She stepped forward from the galley, her voice professional but carrying an edge of protective anger. Ma'am, I'd be happy to ensure you receive the same meal service as all other passengers, regardless of seating location. Miranda whirled around to face the flight attendant, her eyes flashing with aristocratic indignation. Absolutely not. We specifically requested premium catering for 2 passengers. We're not subsidizing meal service for unauthorized additions to our flight. The company catering order includes provisions for up to 6 passengers, Carmen said carefully. Standard protocol requires equal service for all travelers. Derek pulled out his wallet and extracted a platinum credit card, waving it in the air like a weapon. We'll pay extra for meal exclusivity, whatever it costs to ensure our dietary preferences aren't compromised by additional passenger requirements. I don't think that's how airline catering works, Carmen replied, her professional composure beginning to crack. This isn't an airline, Miranda said with icy precision. This is a private charter. Private rules, private decisions, private consequences for people who don't understand their place. The phrase hung in the air like poison gas. Diana's expression remained calm, but her smartwatch buzzed with an incoming message that made her glance down briefly. The text was from her head of security legal team monitoring real-time transcripts. Recording everything. Green light to proceed. Diana looked back up at Miranda with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. My place? Could you elaborate on what you think my place should be? Miranda's smile turned predatory as she sensed vulnerability. Your place is wherever people like you typically sit when they fly. Coach seats, back of the plane, crew areas, places that match your budget and your background. Derek nodded eagerly, apparently proud of his fiancée's directness. Exactly. This isn't about discrimination. It's about appropriate arrangements based on realistic expectations. You wouldn't go to a 5-star restaurant in casual clothes and expect premium service, would you? So my clothes indicate my inability to afford first-class service, Diana asked. Among other things, Miranda said, her voice dripping with condescension. Look, I'm sure you're a lovely person, but this level of luxury service isn't meant for everyone. It's designed for people who understand quality and can appreciate the investment required to maintain these standards. Trevor stepped closer, apparently deciding that the Whitfields had given him sufficient cover to be more explicitly threatening. Miss Blake, I'm offering you a reasonable alternative that allows this flight to proceed on schedule. If you continue to resist appropriate passenger arrangements, I'll have no choice but to contact airport security for passenger removal. Passenger removal? Diana's voice carried a note of genuine interest. On what specific grounds would you justify removing a passenger with confirmed reservations who hasn't violated any safety regulations or company policies? Disruptive behavior, Trevor said quickly. Failure to comply with crew instructions regarding passenger safety and charter exclusivity requirements. Carmen Santos felt her training kick in as she recognized the legal implications of what Trevor was threatening. Captain passenger removal requires documentation of specific safety violations or regulatory non-compliance. Seating preference disputes don't typically meet removal criteria under federal aviation guidelines. Trevor turned on Carmen with barely controlled fury. Focus on your service duties and let me handle operational decisions. Your job is to serve passengers, not provide legal commentary on crew authority. That was when Diana stood up again, this time moving to the center of the cabin where everyone could see her clearly. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to boardroom confrontations and congressional testimony. I want to ensure I understand everyone's position clearly before we proceed. Captain McKenzie, you're threatening to have me removed from this aircraft because you believe I don't belong in first class. Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, you support this action because you believe your charter payment gives you authority to determine other passengers' appropriate seating based on your assessment of their financial status and social background. Is this an accurate summary? The cabin fell silent as everyone processed the implications of having their positions stated so clearly and directly. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the aircraft the only sound was the quiet hum of recording devices capturing every word for posterity. Miranda looked around at the faces watching her, suddenly aware that whatever she said next would be preserved forever. But her arrogance outweighed her caution. "Yes," she said firmly. "That's exactly right. Private charter means private rules. And our rules don't include sharing space with people who can't afford to be here." Diana nodded slowly, as if filing away information for future reference. "Thank you for your honesty. I appreciate clarity in all my business dealings." Something in the way she said business dealings made Trevor pause, as if a warning bell had started ringing somewhere in the back of his mind. But before he could process the implication, Diana had returned to her seat and picked up her book, apparently dismissing the entire confrontation as completed. "Ma'am," Trevor said, his voice tight with frustration, "I need your compliance with seating arrangements before we can complete departure procedures." Diana looked up from her book with what appeared to be mild surprise. "Captain, I've been compliant throughout this entire conversation. I've remained in my assigned seat, followed all safety protocols, and documented crew interactions as permitted under federal aviation regulations. What specific non-compliance are you referring to?" The question trapped Trevor in a logic loop that made his next moves legally and professionally dangerous. He was demanding that Diana move based on criteria he couldn't articulate without explicitly acknowledging discrimination. She was forcing him to either retreat or cross lines that could end his career. Unfortunately for Trevor, retreat had never been in his vocabulary. Trevor's patience, what little remained of it, finally snapped completely. His face flushed red as he pointed an accusatory finger at Diana, his voice rising to a level that made even Miranda Whitfield take a step backward. "That's it. I've tried to handle this diplomatically, but you're clearly determined to disrupt this flight and interfere with our paying customers' experience. This is my final warning. Move to the crew rest area immediately, or I will contact airport security and have you removed from this aircraft for trespassing and disorderly conduct." Diana closed her book deliberately and placed it on the table beside her recording device. When she looked up at Trevor, her expression carried the kind of calm that preceded major storms. "Trespassing," she said, her voice soft but carrying clearly throughout the cabin. "That's a serious accusation, Captain. Could you explain the legal basis for charging a passenger with confirmed reservations with trespassing on an aircraft they're authorized to board?" Trevor's jaw worked as he struggled to formulate an answer that would justify his threat without exposing himself to liability. The truth was that he had no legal grounds for passenger removal, but admitting that would undermine his authority in front of the Whitfields. "Disorderly conduct," he said finally. "Failure to comply with crew instructions regarding passenger safety and operational requirements. I have full discretionary authority over passenger arrangements on this aircraft." Jake Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom from the cockpit. "Captain, we need to discuss departure procedures. Weather window is closing rapidly." "Handle it," Trevor snapped without taking his eyes off Diana. "I'm dealing with a passenger compliance issue that needs immediate resolution." Miranda Whitfield moved closer to Trevor, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to having service workers jump when she spoke. "Captain, call the police. She's clearly trying to scam her way onto our private flight, and she's being disruptive and possibly dangerous." "Dangerous?" Diana's eyebrows rose slightly. "Could you elaborate on what specific dangerous behavior I've exhibited?" Derek Whitfield pulled out his platinum credit card again, apparently believing that financial displays would solve any problem. "We'll pay extra for immediate passenger removal. whatever it costs to get this person off our plane and ensure our privacy." "Your plane?" Diana repeated the same question she had asked earlier, but with slightly more emphasis this time. Trevor sensed support from the paying customers and decided to escalate to his final threat. He moved closer to Diana's seat, looming over her in a way that was clearly intended to be physically intimidating. "Miss Blake, I'm calling airport security right now. You have 60 seconds to collect your belongings and move to the crew area, or you'll be forcibly removed from this aircraft and charged with federal aviation violations." He pulled out his phone with theatrical flourish, his thumb hovering over the contact for airport security. "Your choice. Comply voluntarily or face criminal charges for interference with commercial aviation operations." Carmen Santos felt her heart racing as she watched the confrontation reach its breaking point. Everything in her training told her that Trevor was making threats he couldn't legally support, but she was too junior and too new to challenge a captain's authority directly. Instead, she moved quietly to her station and began documenting the incident through her own company reporting channels. Diana looked around the cabin at the faces staring down at her. Trevor, red-faced and aggressive, phone in hand. Miranda practically vibrating with malicious satisfaction at the prospect of seeing Diana humiliated. Derek nodding approvingly as if passenger removal was a reasonable business expense. Even Jake Morrison was visible in the cockpit doorway, his face grim, but his position too precarious to intervene directly. When Diana spoke, her voice carried across the cabin with perfect clarity and control. "Captain McKenzie, before you make that call, I want to give you one final opportunity to reconsider your position. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with threatening criminal charges against a passenger who has violated no regulations, broken no laws, and complied with all legitimate crew instructions?" Trevor's thumb moved closer to his phone screen. "I'm certain. You've been given multiple opportunities to resolve this situation peacefully. Your continued defiance of crew authority constitutes grounds for immediate removal." "Defiance of crew authority," Diana repeated slowly as if testing the words for accuracy. "Interesting interpretation. What specific crew authority am I defying?" "My authority as captain of this aircraft to ensure passenger safety and operational security through appropriate seating arrangements." "And your determination that I require different seating arrangements is based on what safety considerations?" Trevor's face grew redder as he realized Diana was methodically dismantling his justifications in front of witnesses. But he was too committed to his course of action to retreat now. "Based on my professional assessment of passenger compatibility, charter exclusivity requirements, and operational efficiency standards," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush of bureaucratic language designed to obscure rather than clarify. Miranda clapped her hands together with delight. "Perfect. Call security now. This whole situation has gone on far too long." Derek nodded vigorously. "Absolutely. We're paying customers, and we shouldn't have to tolerate this level of disruption to our chartered flight experience." Diana stood up one final time, her full height and presence commanding the cabin's attention. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. "Captain McKenzie, Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, I want to ensure we all understand the situation completely before any irreversible actions are taken. You are threatening to have me arrested and removed from this aircraft because you believe I don't belong in first-class seating. This decision is based on your assessment of my appearance, your assumptions about my financial status, and your judgment about my social appropriateness for private aviation services. Is this a complete and accurate summary of your position?" The cabin fell silent except for the wind outside and the quiet hum of recording devices capturing every word. Trevor, Miranda, and Derek all seemed to sense that they were being asked to commit to a position that might have consequences they hadn't fully considered. But arrogance and entitlement have their own momentum, and all three had passed the point where retreat was possible. Trevor straightened to his full height, phone in hand. "Yes, that's exactly right. This is my aircraft. These are my operational decisions, and you're going to comply with my instructions or face the consequences." Miranda smiled triumphantly. Finally, someone with authority who understands appropriate standards. Derek nodded approvingly. Exactly what we paid for. Professional crew management and passenger control. Diana's response was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a judge pronouncing a sentence. "Thank you all for making your positions so clear. I wanted to give you every opportunity to reconsider before we reached this point. Since you've all chosen to proceed, let's see how this conversation looks in federal court." That was when Trevor realized that Diana's smartwatch hadn't just been recording audio. The small screen was displaying a live video feed that showed his face, Miranda's gestures, and Derek's credit card waving in crystal clear high definition. But it was too late to change course. Trevor had already pressed the contact for airport security, and the phone was already ringing on the other end. The phone call to airport security took exactly 47 seconds, and Trevor McKenzie used every one of them to seal his professional fate. His voice carried the authoritative tone of a veteran pilot reporting a legitimate security threat, completely unaware that every word was being transmitted in real time to servers monitored by legal teams in 3 different countries. Security control. This is Captain McKenzie on aircraft N1127DR at Teterboro. I need immediate assistance with passenger removal. We have an individual refusing to comply with crew instructions and disrupting charter operations. Request immediate response for trespassing and disorderly conduct. Diana remained seated throughout the call, her expression unchanged as she watched Trevor dig his professional grave deeper with each word. Her smartwatch displayed a steady stream of notifications as Diana's security team legal department and senior executives received real-time alerts about the developing situation. Miranda Whitfield practically glowed with satisfaction as she listened to Trevor's call. Perfect. Finally, someone who understands proper service standards and passenger control. Derek pulled out his phone and began recording his own version of events, apparently convinced that documenting Diana's removal would provide entertaining content for his social media followers. This is exactly why we pay premium rates for private aviation. Professional crew management and immediate response to disruptive passengers. Carmen Santos felt sick as she listened to the security call. Everything in her customer service training told her this situation was wrong, but Trevor's authority as captain and the Whitfield's status as paying customers left her with no clear path for intervention. Instead, she continued documenting the incident through internal company channels, hoping someone with more authority would recognize the legal disaster unfolding in the cabin. Jake Morrison appeared in the cockpit doorway again, his face pale as he absorbed the implications of what Trevor had just done. "Captain, I need to discuss weather updates and departure windows. We're facing potential grounding if we don't resolve departure procedures immediately." "I said handle it." Trevor snapped, his attention focused entirely on what he perceived as victory over a troublesome passenger. "Airport security is en route. This situation will be resolved in minutes, and then we can proceed with normal flight operations." That was when Diana stood up for what would be the final time during this confrontation. When she spoke, her voice carried across the cabin with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone present stop what they were doing and pay attention. "Captain McKenzie, before airport security arrives, I want to give you one last chance to reverse course. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with having me forcibly removed from this aircraft?" Trevor's confidence was unshakable now that professional backup was en route. "Absolutely certain. You've refused multiple reasonable requests to relocate to appropriate seating. You've disrupted charter operations and interfered with paying customers' legitimate expectations. Security removal is the only remaining option." Miranda stepped closer to Diana, her voice dripping with condescending satisfaction. "You should have just moved when you were asked nicely." Now you get to experience the consequences of trying to fly above your proper place in the world. Derek nodded eagerly, still recording. This is what happens when people try to scam their way into premium services they can't afford. Professional crews know how to handle these situations appropriately. Diana reached into her bag and withdrew a leather folder embossed with a corporate logo that none of them recognized. She opened it carefully and removed several documents, holding them where everyone in the cabin could see them clearly. Before security arrives, she said quietly, "I think it's important that everyone understand exactly who is being removed from this aircraft and on what grounds." Trevor glanced at the documents dismissively. "Whatever paperwork you think you have doesn't change the fact that you're disrupting charter operations and refusing to comply with crew instructions." Diana held up the first document. "This is my Federal Aviation Administration identification card, which authorizes me to access any aircraft registered under Apex Global Industries operating certificate." Trevor's confidence flickered slightly, but he pressed forward. "Apex Global has thousands of employees. Having company credentials doesn't give you automatic access to chartered aircraft or override paying customers' exclusivity arrangements." Diana held up the second document. "This is the aircraft registration for tail number N11127DR, which shows the legal owner of this specific plane." Miranda laughed sharply. "So what? You work for the company that owns the plane. That doesn't mean you get to bump paying customers out of premium seating." Diana held up the third document. "This is my corporate identification as the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Global Industries, which owns this aircraft, employs every person on this crew, and operates the charter services that you believe give you authority over other passengers." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Trevor's face drained of color as the implications crashed over him. Miranda's laugh died in her throat as she stared at the documents in Diana's hands. Derek's phone slipped slightly in his grip as his recording captured his own shocked expression. Carmen Santos felt her knees go weak as she realized she had just witnessed her company's CEO being threatened with arrest by her own employee. Jake Morrison stepped fully into the cabin, his face grave as he looked between Diana and his captain. "Holy shit," he whispered, forgetting all professional protocols in the face of what had just been revealed. Diana's voice remained perfectly calm as she continued. "The tail number N127DR represents my initials and birthday. Diana Rodriguez, December 27th. I personally approved the specifications for this aircraft, selected the interior designer, and established the service standards that are supposed to ensure all passengers are treated with dignity and respect." Trevor opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His mind was racing through the implications of what he had just done. He had threatened to arrest his own CEO. He had called her disruptive and inappropriate. He had supported passengers who called her unsuitable for first-class service. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens indicated that airport security was responding to his call for passenger removal. Miranda found her voice first, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "That's impossible. You can't be. You're wearing a hoodie. You look like—" "Like what?" Diana asked softly. Derek's phone continued recording as his face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. "But we thought you were. What did you think I was?" The sirens grew closer as Diana held up the final document. "This is the passenger manifest for today's flight, which shows that D. Blake Diana Blake Rodriguez is listed as a VIP passenger with full authorization for any seating assignment on this aircraft." Trevor's legs seemed to give out slightly as he grasped the magnitude of his mistake. He had just called airport security to remove his own boss from her own plane. Diana looked around the cabin at faces frozen in shock and disbelief. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of 15 years of building an empire and the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "The question now is what happens when airport security arrives and discovers that you've called them to remove the aircraft's owner for the crime of sitting in her own seat." Through the cabin windows, blue and red lights flashed across the snow-covered tarmac as security vehicles approached the aircraft. Trevor's phone call had set in motion a chain of events that couldn't be stopped, and everyone in the cabin was about to discover exactly what accountability looked like when it arrived with badges and handcuffs. Diana resumed her seat and picked up her book, apparently satisfied that her point had been made with sufficient clarity. "I suggest everyone prepare for an interesting conversation with airport security," she said quietly. "I imagine they'll have quite a few questions about this passenger removal request." The Aspen-Pitkin County Airport materialized through the blizzard like a mirage of civilization carved into the Colorado wilderness. The Gulfstream G750's landing lights cut through swirling snow as Jake Morrison guided the aircraft through the approach pattern with hands that trembled slightly from the tension that had gripped the cabin for the past 3 hours. No one had spoken during the final hour of flight. Trevor McKenzie sat in the cockpit jump seat, his captain's uniform disheveled and his face the color of week-old newspaper. Miranda and Derek Whitfield huddled in their seats, whispering frantically as they tried to process the revelation that had shattered their worldview. Carmen Santos moved through her post-flight duties with mechanical precision, her mind racing through the implications of what she had witnessed. And Diana Rodriguez Blake sat quietly in seat 1A, reading her book as if nothing unusual had occurred. But unusual was an understatement that barely scraped the surface of what had transpired at 35,000 feet. During the flight, while Trevor stared at his hands and the Whitfields conducted damage control conversations, Diana had been conducting business through her smartwatch and tablet. Real-time communication with her legal team, her security department, and the executive leadership of Apex Global Industries. The notifications streaming across her devices told a story of corporate machinery mobilizing with military precision. Her head of security had coordinated with local law enforcement. Her legal team had prepared comprehensive documentation of the incident. Her public relations department had crafted statements for the media storm that was already building around hashtags and viral video clips. But most importantly, Elena Rodriguez, Diana's director of ground operations, and a woman who had been with the company since its early days, was waiting on the tarmac with a team of personnel who understood exactly what had happened and what needed to happen next. As the aircraft's wheels touched down on the snow-slicked runway, Diana's smartwatch displayed a message from Elena ground team in position. Local authorities briefed. Media containment active. Ready for your instructions. Diana typed back a single word. Proceed. The aircraft taxied toward the private aviation terminal, its navigation lights painting red and blue patterns across the snow. Through the cabin windows, unusual activity was visible on the tarmac. More vehicles than a single private jet would normally warrant. More personnel than a routine arrival would require. Trevor noticed the activity and felt what little hope remained in his chest turn to ice water. "That's a lot of ground support for a regular charter arrival," he muttered to Jake. Jake Morrison had spent the flight reviewing federal aviation regulations and employment law on his tablet. His face was grim as he responded. "That's not ground support, Captain. That's a reception committee." Carmen Santos looked out the cabin windows and recognized several vehicles bearing Apex Global Industries logos alongside airport security and what appeared to be law enforcement. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor company executives en route to Aspen. "Full investigation authorized. Document everything." The Whitfields pressed their faces against the windows, watching the array of official vehicles with growing alarm. Derek's voice was barely above a whisper as he tried to count the personnel visible in the terminal lights. "Miranda, I think we're in serious trouble." Miranda's voice had lost all its earlier arrogance, replaced by something approaching panic. "This can't be happening. She can't actually be who she says she is. People like that don't dress like that. They don't travel like that." Diana closed her book and placed it in her bag with the same calm precision she had maintained throughout the entire flight. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the cabin, despite its quiet tone. People like what, Mrs. Whitfield? Miranda's mouth opened and closed, without producing sound, as if her brain had finally recognized the legal implications of finishing that sentence. The aircraft came to a complete stop, and Jake Morrison began shutdown procedures with mechanical precision. Outside ground personnel moved into position around the plane, but this wasn't the usual service crew preparing for passenger departure. These were individuals with badges, documentation, and the kind of purposeful movement that indicated official business. Trevor unbuckled his harness with hands that shook slightly. Ms. Rodriguez Blake, I need to apologize. If I had known who you were. Diana turned to face him directly, her expression unreadable. Captain McKenzie, if you had known I was a billionaire, you would have treated me with respect. The problem is that you didn't treat me with respect when you thought I was nobody. Character isn't about how you treat people who sign your paychecks. It's about how you treat people who serve your coffee. The words hit Trevor like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of a career-ending revelation. He had spent 25 years in aviation building a reputation that was about to be destroyed by 3 hours of recorded conversation. Diana stood and moved to the aircraft's main door, where she could see Elena Rodriguez approaching with a folder in her hands and a team of serious-looking individuals behind her. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand what's about to happen. When that door opens, you're going to face the consequences of every word you spoke, every assumption you made, and every action you took during this flight. Airport security, federal aviation authorities, and my company's legal team are waiting to discuss your behavior in detail. She paused at the door, release her hand resting on the handle as she looked back at the 4 people whose lives were about to change forever. Captain McKenzie, you threatened to have your own CEO arrested for sitting in her own seat on her own aircraft. Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, you demanded the removal of a passenger based on explicitly discriminatory criteria that you articulated clearly for the record. Ms. Santos, you witnessed discrimination and chose to document it through proper channels rather than participate in it. Carmen Santos felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that Diana had been aware of her internal reporting throughout the entire incident. Diana's hand moved to the door release. The question now isn't whether there will be consequences. The question is what form those consequences will take and how far they'll extend beyond this aircraft. Through the windows, camera flashes were visible as media personnel documented the unusual late-night arrival. Social media notifications continued streaming across multiple devices as the incident gained viral momentum across digital platforms. Before I open this door, Diana said quietly, does anyone want to revise their earlier statements or positions regarding appropriate treatment of passengers who don't appear to meet your expectations? The cabin fell silent except for the wind outside and the quiet hum of ground equipment positioning around the aircraft. Trevor, Miranda, and Derek all seemed frozen in place, their minds racing through options that had disappeared the moment Diana revealed her identity. Very well, Diana said and turned the handle. The aircraft door opened to reveal a scene that looked more like a federal investigation than a routine charter arrival. Elena Rodriguez stood at the base of the stairs wearing an Apex Global Industries parka and an expression that could have frozen the Colorado wind. Behind her, a carefully orchestrated team of personnel represented every aspect of the crisis that was about to unfold. Officer Patricia Valdez of the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office stood with a tablet displaying the audio and video recordings that had been transmitted in real time during the flight. Special Agent Maria Santos from the Federal Aviation Administration held documentation showing the violations of passenger rights and anti-discrimination regulations that had occurred at 35,000 feet. And Dr. James Mitchell, Apex Global's chief legal counsel, carried a briefcase full of employment contracts, federal aviation law references, and civil rights statutes that were about to become very relevant. Diana descended the stairs with the measured pace of someone who had spent years walking into hostile boardrooms and congressional hearing rooms. The wind whipped her hood back, revealing her face clearly for the first time to the assembled personnel and the media cameras positioned at a respectful distance. Elena Rodriguez approached immediately, her voice carrying the relief of someone who had spent hours coordinating a response to an unprecedented situation. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, we've documented everything from the real-time transmissions, audio-video witness statements, and federal regulatory violations. How would you like to proceed? Diana accepted the folder. Elena offered its contents, representing 3 hours of evidence that would reshape multiple careers and potentially influence federal aviation policy. Status report first. Then we address immediate violations. Then we discuss long-term implications. Behind Diana, the aircraft's other passengers began descending the stairs. Trevor McKenzie emerged first, his captain's uniform looking disheveled and his face pale as he took in the scope of the official response. His eyes moved across the badges, the documentation, and the media presence with growing alarm. Officer Valdez stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of law enforcement conducting an official investigation. Captain McKenzie, I need to discuss the passenger removal request you made during flight operations. We have recordings of the entire incident, and there are some serious questions about the grounds for your security call. Trevor's voice came out as a croak. Officer, there was a misunderstanding about passenger identification and seating arrangements. If I had realized who Ms. Rodriguez-Blake was. The problem isn't that you didn't recognize her. Special Agent Santos interrupted, holding up her tablet displaying federal aviation regulations. The problem is that you threatened passenger removal based on discriminatory criteria that violate federal anti-discrimination statutes. Your recognition of her identity doesn't change the nature of your actions. Miranda and Derek Whitfield reached the bottom of the stairs, clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. Their earlier arrogance had been replaced by visible panic as they absorbed the official response to their behavior. Derek's phone, which had recorded so much of their discriminatory commentary, now felt like evidence in his hands. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, his legal training evident in the precise way he articulated the situation. Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, we need to discuss the statements you made regarding passenger exclusion and service discrimination. These statements were made in the presence of witnesses and have been documented in multiple formats that constitute legal evidence. Miranda found her voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. We were just trying to ensure our privacy. We paid for exclusive charter service. We didn't know she was... You didn't know she was the CEO of the company, Elena Rodriguez said, her voice cutting through Miranda's explanation. But that's not the legal issue here. The legal issue is that you demanded passenger removal based on explicitly discriminatory criteria that you articulated clearly and repeatedly. Derek pulled out his platinum credit card again, apparently believing that financial solutions might still be available. Look, we're willing to pay for any misunderstanding. Additional fees, compensation, whatever it takes to resolve this situation appropriately. Dr. Mitchell's expression suggested that Derek had just made the situation significantly worse. Mr. Whitfield, you're offering financial compensation for discriminatory treatment of passengers on a federally regulated aircraft. That statement is being recorded and may constitute additional evidence of intentional civil rights violations. Carmen Santos descended the stairs last, her employee badge visible, and her face showing the strain of 3 hours spent witnessing workplace discrimination while feeling powerless to stop it. Diana approached her, directly, speaking quietly enough that their conversation remained private despite the surrounding official activity. Carmen, your internal reports during the flight were noted and appreciated. Your documentation may be crucial for addressing the widespread problems this incident has revealed. Carmen's voice was shaky with relief and lingering fear. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, I knew what was happening was wrong, but I was afraid to challenge the captain directly. I'm so sorry I couldn't do more. You did exactly what you should have done, Diana replied. You documented violations through proper channels and refused to participate in discriminatory behavior. Your actions may help ensure this doesn't happen to other passengers. Officer Valdez moved closer to the group, her attention focused on Trevor McKenzie. Captain, we need to discuss the federal implications of your passenger removal request. Threatening arrest based on discriminatory criteria during federal flight operations constitutes multiple violations that require immediate attention. Trevor's legs seemed unsteady as he realized the full scope of his legal exposure. Officer I was trying to manage charter exclusivity requirements. I didn't intend to discriminate. I was balancing passenger needs and operational efficiency. Your intentions aren't relevant to the regulatory violations, Special Agent Santos said, consulting her documentation. Federal aviation law prohibits passenger discrimination based on race, ethnicity, appearance, or assumed economic status. Your recorded statements indicate clear violations of these protections. Diana looked around at the assembled personnel, the media presence, and the 4 individuals whose actions had triggered this unprecedented response. When she spoke, her voice carried across the tarmac with the authority of someone accustomed to addressing Congress and corporate boards. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened on this aircraft tonight represents more than individual misconduct. It represents institutional problems that require institutional solutions. Captain McKenzie's threats, the Whitfield's discriminatory demands, and the underlying assumptions that made this incident possible all point to broader issues that need comprehensive addressing. She paused, allowing her words to sink in as wind whipped across the tarmac and snow continued falling around the assembled group. This incident will not be resolved with apologies, financial compensation, or individual discipline. It will be resolved with fundamental changes to how passengers are treated, how crews are trained, and how companies are held accountable for discrimination that occurs under their authority. The gravity of her statement was emphasized by the official documentation being prepared, the media coverage being broadcast, and the federal investigations being initiated based on 3 hours of recorded evidence. The consequences begin now, Diana said quietly and turned toward Elena Rodriguez to begin the process that would reshape multiple careers and potentially influence federal aviation policy. Elena Rodriguez had spent 15 years working with Diana Rodriguez Blake from the early days when Apex Global operated out of a converted warehouse to the current reality of managing a multi-billion-dollar empire. She had seen Diana navigate hostile takeovers, congressional hearings, and international trade disputes with the same calm precision that had characterized her behavior during the flight. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt personal. Ms. Rodriguez Blake. Elena said, opening her folder to reveal meticulously organized documentation. We've prepared comprehensive responses to every aspect of this incident. Federal Aviation Administration violations, civil rights law breaches, employment contract defaults, and media strategy coordination. Where would you like to begin? Diana glanced toward the media personnel maintaining their respectful distance, their cameras capturing the unprecedented scene of a major corporation's CEO conducting business on a snowy tarmac at midnight on Christmas Eve. The story was already spreading across social media platforms, and her public relations team had identified hashtags gaining viral momentum, #PrivateJetJustice, #DianaBlake, and #ApexAccountability. Begin with immediate employment actions, Diana said. Captain McKenzie's contract, the Whitfield's service agreements, and documentation of tonight's violations for federal review. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with legal documentation that had been prepared during the flight based on real-time transmission of the incident. Captain McKenzie, your employment contract with Apex Global Industries includes specific clauses regarding passenger treatment, anti-discrimination compliance, and professional conduct standards. Your actions tonight constitute material breach of contract in multiple categories. Trevor McKenzie's face went gray as he realized that his career wasn't just threatened, it was already over. Dr. Mitchell, I need to explain the context of what happened. There were operational pressures and charter exclusivity requirements that complicated the passenger arrangement situation. Captain Diana's voice cut through his explanation with surgical precision. Let me be absolutely clear about what's happening. You threatened to have your own CEO arrested for the crime of being black and sitting in first class. There is no operational context that justifies that behavior. Officer Valdez consulted her documentation, which included transcripts of Trevor's recorded statements. Captain McKenzie, your security call requested passenger removal for trespassing and disorderly conduct. The recordings show no evidence of disorderly conduct and clear evidence that the passenger had confirmed reservations. Your removal request appears to have been based solely on discriminatory criteria. Special Agent Santos stepped closer, her federal badge catching the light from the aircraft's windows. Captain, Federal aviation regulations specifically prohibit passenger discrimination based on race, ethnicity, appearance, or assumed economic status. Your recorded statements indicate willful violation of these protections during federal flight operations. Trevor's voice cracked as the reality of federal charges began to sink in. Agent Santos, I need to clarify that my passenger arrangement requests were based on charter exclusivity agreements and operational efficiency considerations, not on any discriminatory factors. Captain Dr. Mitchell said, consulting his legal documentation, we have audio and video recordings of you stating that Ms. Rodriguez-Blake was not the type of passenger who typically flies in first class, and that she would be more comfortable in crew seating areas. These statements constitute explicit evidence of discriminatory reasoning. Diana turned her attention to Miranda and Derek Whitfield, who were huddled together near the aircraft stairs looking like they were attending their own funeral. Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, your charter agreement with Apex Global Industries includes clauses regarding passenger behavior and compliance with federal anti-discrimination laws. Your statements tonight constitute material breach of those agreements. Miranda found her voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, we had no idea who you were. If we had known you were the CEO, we never would have. Exactly the problem, Diana interrupted. You treated me badly because you thought you could get away with it. Character isn't about how you behave when people are watching. It's about how you behave when you think no one important is paying attention. Derek pulled out his phone, apparently hoping to delete the recordings he had made during the flight. Dr. Mitchell noticed the action immediately. Mr. Whitfield, that device contains evidence related to federal civil rights violations. Tampering with or destroying that evidence would constitute additional federal charges. Derek's hand froze as he realized that his own recordings had become evidence against him. Dr. Mitchell, those recordings were made for personal documentation purposes. I wasn't trying to create evidence of anything inappropriate. Unfortunately, Special Agent Santos said your recordings captured explicit statements demanding passenger removal based on discriminatory criteria. Those recordings are now federal evidence, regardless of their intended purpose. Elena Rodriguez approached Diana with additional documentation, her voice carrying the efficiency of someone managing a complex crisis in real time. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake media inquiries are flooding in from major news networks. The story is trending nationally on social media platforms. How would you like to handle public communications? Diana looked around at the assembled personnel, the official investigation taking place, and the historical significance of what was happening. Issue a statement that Apex Global Industries has zero tolerance for discrimination in any form, and that tonight's incident demonstrates our commitment to accountability at every level of our organization. She paused, considering the broader implications of the moment. Also announce that we're launching a comprehensive review of passenger treatment protocols across our entire aviation division and implementing new training programs to ensure this never happens again. Carmen Santos approached hesitantly, her employee badge identifying her clearly to the assembled personnel. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, I want to apologize for not speaking up more forcefully during the incident. I knew what was happening was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my job. Diana's expression softened as she addressed the young woman who had shown integrity under pressure. Carmen, you handled the situation exactly as you should have. You documented violations through proper channels and refused to participate in discriminatory behavior. Your actions tonight demonstrate the kind of character we need throughout our organization." Officer Valdez stepped forward with official documentation, her voice carrying the weight of law enforcement conducting a federal investigation. "Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, we need to discuss the formal complaint process for the violations that occurred during federal flight operations. The evidence we've collected indicates multiple criminal and civil violations that require federal prosecution." Diana nodded slowly, understanding that the consequences of tonight's incident would extend far beyond individual discipline or corporate policy changes. "Officer Valdez, I want full prosecution under federal law for all applicable violations. This incident represents more than personal misconduct. It represents institutional problems that require institutional accountability." The wind across the tarmac carried the sound of approaching vehicles as additional personnel arrived to document the unprecedented situation. Media coverage was expanding beyond local outlets to national networks. Federal investigators were coordinating with local law enforcement, and somewhere in the distance the sound of another aircraft approaching suggested that the night's activities were far from over. Diana looked up at the sky where snow continued falling through the lights illuminating the tarmac. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, but tonight was about justice, accountability, and the kind of institutional change that only occurred when people with power decided to use that power responsibly. "Let's proceed with full documentation and prosecution," she said quietly. "It's time for consequences, Doctor." James Mitchell's briefcase contained more than just documentation of tonight's incident. During the flight, while Diana's smartwatch streamed real-time evidence to legal teams across the country, Apex Global's Internal Investigation Division had been conducting emergency audits of personnel files, passenger complaints, and incident reports that painted a disturbing picture of institutional problems. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, Dr. Mitchell said, opening a second folder that contained information far more damaging than the night's events, "Our emergency investigation has revealed that Captain McKenzie's behavior tonight was not an isolated incident. We've identified a pattern of discrimination complaints and passenger mistreatment that extends back several years." Diana's expression hardened as she absorbed the implications. Elaborate. Elena Rodriguez consulted her tablet, which displayed investigation results that had been compiled during the flight. Captain McKenzie has been the subject of 7 formal discrimination complaints over the past 4 years. All were settled with non-disclosure agreements and financial compensation. None resulted in disciplinary action or additional training requirements. Trevor McKenzie's face went white as he realized that his past conduct was being exposed in front of federal investigators and law enforcement officials. Those complaints were all resolved through appropriate human resources channels. There were no findings of misconduct or regulatory violations. Special Agent Santos looked up from her own documentation, which now included the newly discovered complaint history. Captain, non-disclosure settlements don't eliminate federal liability for civil rights violations. If anything, a pattern of complaints suggests institutional knowledge of discriminatory behavior without corrective action. Dr. Mitchell opened additional files, his legal training evident in how he organized the revelations for maximum impact. The investigation has also revealed that passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment were not being forwarded to federal authorities as required by aviation regulations. Our charter division was handling these incidents internally to avoid regulatory scrutiny. Officer Valdez made notes on her incident report, understanding that the scope of potential violations was expanding far beyond tonight's events. That constitutes obstruction of federal oversight and possible conspiracy to conceal civil rights violations during federal aviation operations. Diana felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the same emotion that had driven her to build an empire after being told she didn't fit the profile for business success. But this anger was colder, more focused, carrying the weight of institutional authority and the responsibility to ensure problems received comprehensive solutions. "How many complaints were buried?" she asked. Elena Rodriguez scrolled through the emergency audit results, her face grim as she compiled numbers that represented real people who had experienced real discrimination. 47 complaints over the past 3 years involving passenger treatment based on race, ethnicity, appearance, or perceived economic status. None were reported to federal authorities. All were resolved with internal discipline that typically involved verbal warnings or brief sensitivity training sessions. Carmen Santos listened to the revelations with growing horror, understanding that her employer had been covering up exactly the kind of discrimination she had witnessed tonight. Ms. Rodriguez Blake: "I had no idea the company was handling these issues internally. My training emphasized reporting all discrimination incidents to federal authorities." "Your training was correct," Diana said. "The charter division was apparently operating under different protocols that violated federal law and company policy." Derek Whitfield, still clinging to his wife beside the aircraft stairs, seemed to realize that their individual incident was part of a much larger pattern that would attract significant federal attention. "Are you saying that passenger discrimination is common on these flights?" Dr. Mitchell consulted his documentation, which included testimony from crew members who had been interviewed during the emergency investigation. "Our investigation indicates that discriminatory passenger treatment became normalized in the charter division, with crew members encouraged to manage difficult passengers through seating arrangements and service modifications that avoided direct confrontation." Miranda Whitfield's voice was barely audible as she processed the implications. "So when we demanded that she move to the back of the plane, we were participating in a pattern of discrimination that was already established." "Exactly," Diana said. "You didn't invent the discrimination. You simply participated in a culture of discrimination that was enabled by inadequate oversight and accountability." Special Agent Santos closed her initial documentation and opened a new folder, understanding that the federal investigation was expanding beyond individual violations to institutional compliance failures. Ms. Rodriguez Blake: "These revelations suggest violations of federal oversight requirements and possible civil rights conspiracy charges that could affect multiple personnel across your charter operations division." Diana nodded slowly, understanding that comprehensive accountability would require more than individual discipline. Agent Santos: "I want full federal investigation of our charter division's compliance practices, personnel training programs, and incident reporting procedures. If we've been violating federal law, I want every violation identified and addressed." Trevor McKenzie made one final attempt to minimize his exposure, apparently unaware that his situation had moved far beyond individual consequences. "Ms. Rodriguez Blake, I was following established protocols for managing passenger arrangements and charter exclusivity requirements. If those protocols were inappropriate, that represents institutional problems, not individual misconduct." Diana's response was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Captain McKenzie, you threatened to arrest your own CEO for being black in first class. No protocol established or otherwise justifies that behavior. You will face individual consequences for individual choices regardless of any institutional context. Doctor." Mitchell approached Diana with a final folder, this one containing legal recommendations that would reshape how Apex Global Industries handled passenger rights and crew accountability. "Ms. Rodriguez Blake, our legal team recommends immediate implementation of federal oversight protocols, mandatory crew retraining programs, and partnership with civil rights organizations to ensure comprehensive institutional reform." Diana looked around at the assembled personnel, understanding that tonight's incident had revealed problems that demanded solutions extending far beyond individual punishment. The media coverage, federal investigation, and public attention would create accountability pressures that could influence industry-wide changes. "Implement all recommendations immediately," she said. and announce publicly that Apex Global Industries is cooperating fully with federal investigations and implementing reforms that exceed minimum legal requirements. Elena Rodriguez made notes on her tablet, coordinating the complex response required by the expanding scope of violations and accountability measures. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, the federal investigation timeline suggests this story will remain in national news for several weeks. How should we handle ongoing media coverage? Diana glanced toward the media personnel who were documenting a story that had grown from individual misconduct to institutional failure. Complete transparency, full cooperation with investigators, and absolute commitment to ensuring this never happens again to anyone flying on our aircraft. The wind across the tarmac carried the sound of additional vehicles arriving as the federal investigation expanded to match the scope of violations that had been revealed. Tonight's incident had become tomorrow's institutional reckoning, and Diana Rodriguez-Blake was prepared to use her authority to ensure that justice was comprehensive, permanent, and visible to every person who had ever been told they didn't belong in first class. The conference room at Apex Global Industries' Denver headquarters had been transformed into a command center for what was rapidly becoming the most comprehensive aviation discrimination investigation in federal history. 6 days after the Christmas Eve incident, teams of federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and corporate compliance officers worked around the clock to document the scope of problems that Diana's midnight flight had exposed. David Park, Apex Global's vice president of operations, had flown in from Chicago to coordinate the company's response to what he privately described as the most expensive 3 hours in corporate aviation history. The preliminary audit results spread across the conference table painted a picture of institutional failure that extended far beyond Trevor McKenzie's individual misconduct. Ma'am, David said, addressing Diana as she reviewed investigative reports while simultaneously managing international business operations through her tablet. The federal audit has identified widespread patterns of discriminatory treatment across our entire charter division. We're looking at potential violations affecting over 300 individual incidents and involving 47 crew members. Special Agent Santos, who had been leading the federal investigation since the Aspen incident, consulted files that had grown from a single folder to multiple filing cabinets. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, our investigation indicates that discriminatory passenger treatment became embedded in operational procedures through informal training and crew culture, rather than official policy. New employees were taught by senior personnel that certain passengers required different management approaches based on appearance and assumed economic status. Diana felt the familiar burn of anger that had driven every major decision in her professional life. The same anger that had motivated her to prove wrong every banker who had denied her loans, every investor who had doubted her vision, and every board member who had questioned her leadership. But this anger was tempered by 15 years of corporate responsibility and the understanding that comprehensive solutions required careful strategy rather than emotional reaction. Document everything she said, every incident, every complaint, every piece of training material that enabled this culture of discrimination. I want federal prosecutors to have complete evidence for every potential violation. Dr. Mitchell approached with legal documentation that represented weeks of investigation compressed into days of intensive audit work. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake. The legal implications extend beyond civil rights violations to potential criminal conspiracy charges for concealing federal oversight requirements. The Charter Division was operating under policies designed to minimize federal reporting rather than ensure compliance. Carmen Santos, who had been promoted to Customer Advocacy Specialist and was now working directly with the investigation team, carried testimony from crew members who had been afraid to report discrimination for fear of losing their jobs. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake. We've interviewed 23 current and former employees who described a culture where reporting discrimination incidents was discouraged and where crew members who protested passenger mistreatment faced scheduling reductions and negative performance evaluations. The revelations painted a picture of institutional failure that made Diana question fundamental assumptions about her company's operations. She had built Apex Global Industries on principles of dignity and respect for every person. But somehow an entire division had developed practices that violated those principles while concealing their violations from oversight. Officer Valdez, coordinating between federal and local law enforcement, reviewed criminal charges that were expanding beyond Trevor McKenzie's individual actions. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake. Captain McKenzie's case has led to additional charges against 3 supervisory personnel who were aware of his discrimination complaints, but failed to report them to federal authorities as required by law. Elena Rodriguez managed the complex logistics of coordinating with multiple federal agencies while maintaining normal business operations across Apex Global's international network. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake media coverage has expanded beyond aviation journalism to national civil rights coverage. Congressional representatives are requesting hearings on passenger discrimination in private aviation, and the NAACP has announced plans to file federal lawsuits on behalf of affected passengers. Diana understood that the incident had moved beyond corporate crisis management to become a national conversation about discrimination in luxury service industries. The viral social media coverage, congressional attention, and civil rights organization involvement meant that any response would be scrutinized by millions of people who had experienced similar discrimination in their own lives. "What's the status on victim identification and compensation?" Diana asked. David Park consulted files containing contact information for passengers who had experienced discrimination over the past 3 years. "We've identified contact information for approximately 200 passengers who filed complaints that were handled internally rather than reported to federal authorities. Our legal team is preparing compensation packages and formal apologies for every identified victim." Special Agent Santos reviewed federal requirements for institutional reform that would extend far beyond individual punishment. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake. Federal oversight requires implementation of monitoring approaches, training programs, and accountability measures that exceed minimum compliance standards. The goal is to ensure that discrimination becomes practically impossible rather than just discouraged. Diana absorbed the scope of changes required to address problems that had been years in the making. The financial costs would be measured in millions of dollars. The operational changes would affect every aspect of charter operations. The reputational impact would require years of demonstrated commitment to rebuilding trust. But the alternative, allowing discrimination to continue while hiding behind non-disclosure agreements and internal discipline, was unacceptable to someone who had built her success on proving wrong every person who had ever told her she didn't belong. "Implement everything the federal investigation recommends," Diana said. "Training programs, monitoring approaches, accountability measures, and ongoing oversight that exceeds legal requirements. I want Apex Global to become the industry standard for passenger rights and crew accountability." Carmen Santos raised her hand hesitantly, understanding that her question might seem naive given the scope of problems being discussed. "Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, how do we ensure that employees feel safe reporting discrimination without fear of retaliation? The investigation shows that crew members were afraid to speak up because they thought it would cost them their jobs." Diana's expression softened as she recognized the courage it had taken for Carmen to maintain her integrity during the Christmas Eve incident. "Carmen, that's the most important question anyone has asked during this entire investigation. We create safety for reporting discrimination by making retaliation more dangerous than discrimination itself." Dr. Mitchell made notes on legal structures that would protect employees who reported discrimination while creating severe consequences for anyone who attempted retaliation. "We're implementing whistleblower protection programs, anonymous reporting approaches, and regular audit procedures that make discrimination impossible to hide and retaliation illegal to attempt." The conference room fell silent as everyone absorbed the scope of changes required to address institutional problems that had been years in the making. Outside the windows, snow continued falling across Denver. But inside the room, the work of rebuilding trust and ensuring justice continued around the clock. Diana looked around at the faces of people who were working to ensure that no passenger would ever again experience what she had experienced on Christmas Eve. "This investigation isn't about punishment," she said quietly. "It's about prevention. We're building approaches that make discrimination impossible, rather than just illegal." 3 weeks after the Christmas Eve incident, Diana Rodriguez Blake stood before a packed auditorium at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, to announce the launch of Respect Sky, a comprehensive platform designed to monitor, prevent, and respond to discrimination in aviation and luxury service industries. The audience included federal investigators, civil rights leaders, aviation industry executives, and passengers who had experienced discrimination across multiple service sectors. Behind Diana, a large screen displayed real-time data from the platform's beta testing, which had already identified and addressed 12 potential discrimination incidents across 6 different companies. "Ladies and gentlemen," Diana began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 3 weeks transforming personal injustice into institutional change. 3 weeks ago, I was told to move to the back of a plane I owned because someone decided I didn't look like I belonged in first class. Tonight, I'm announcing a platform that will ensure no one else experiences that kind of discrimination in any service setting. The applause was immediate and sustained, but Diana raised her hand for quiet understanding that the announcement was more important than the applause. Marcus Thompson, the social media influencer who had live-streamed the original incident to over 2 million viewers, sat in the front row with a camera capturing the platform launch for his followers. His viral documentation had become the foundation for legislative hearings and corporate accountability measures that were spreading across multiple industries. Respect Sky operates on 3 fundamental principles. Diana continued. Real-time monitoring, immediate intervention, and comprehensive accountability. Let me show you how it works. The screen behind her displayed an interface that looked deceptively simple, but represented months of artificial intelligence development and civil rights law integration. Carmen Santos, now serving as Director of Customer Advocacy, demonstrated the platform's passenger reporting approach, which allowed individuals to document discrimination incidents through smartphone applications that automatically transmitted evidence to federal authorities and civil rights organizations. When a passenger experiences discrimination, Carmen explained, her voice carrying confidence that had grown from her role in the federal investigation, they can activate Respect Sky through their phone smartwatch or any connected device. The platform immediately documents the incident with audio and video recording, transmits evidence to multiple oversight organizations, and connects the passenger with legal support resources. Special Agent Santos, who had been working with technology developers to ensure federal compliance integration, demonstrated the platform's law enforcement interface. For federal investigators, Respect Sky provides real-time notifications of potential civil rights violations, automatic documentation that meets courtroom evidence standards, and coordinated response protocols that ensure immediate intervention when discrimination occurs. The audience included representatives from airlines, hotels, restaurants, and retail companies who had volunteered their organizations for pilot testing after the widespread media coverage of Diana's experience. The preliminary results showed discrimination incidents decreasing by over 80% in organizations using the platform, not because discrimination had disappeared, but because the certainty of documentation and accountability made discriminatory behavior practically impossible. Dr. Mitchell addressed the legal framework that supported the platform's operations. Respect Sky operates under federal civil rights law and aviation regulations to ensure that discrimination becomes legally actionable in real time rather than requiring lengthy investigation and litigation processes. When discrimination occurs, consequences begin immediately rather than months or years later. Elena Rodriguez managed the complex logistics of implementing the platform across multiple industries while maintaining integration with existing corporate operations. We're working with over 40 companies across aviation, hospitality, retail, and healthcare industries to implement comprehensive discrimination monitoring. The goal is to create industry-wide accountability that makes discrimination financially impossible as well as legally unacceptable. Diana moved to the center of the stage, her presence commanding attention from audience members who represented every aspect of the civil rights and business communities. Respect Sky isn't just about catching discrimination after it happens. It's about preventing discrimination by making the consequences immediate, visible, and financially devastating for companies that allow it to occur. The screen displayed financial data showing the costs of discrimination for companies using the platform. Organizations that failed to address discrimination incidents faced real-time publicity, federal investigation, and consumer boycotts that made discriminatory behavior economically catastrophic. "We're not asking companies to be perfect," Diana continued. "We're requiring companies to be accountable. When discrimination occurs, the platform ensures immediate corrective action, comprehensive investigation, and changes that prevent similar incidents from affecting other customers." Marcus Thompson raised his hand from the audience, his question representing millions of social media followers who had been following the story since Christmas Eve. "Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, how do you prevent companies from simply refusing to participate in respect?" Sky, monitoring Diana's smile, suggested she had anticipated exactly this question. Marcus: "That's where market pressure becomes more effective than regulatory pressure. Companies that refuse Respect Sky monitoring face consumer awareness campaigns that highlight their unwillingness to ensure discrimination-free service. Customers vote with their wallets, and increasingly customers are choosing companies that demonstrate commitment to treating everyone with dignity and respect." The platform's implementation timeline showed expansion across major metropolitan areas within 6 months, national coverage within 12 months, and international adoption within 18 months. Corporate partnerships included major airlines, hotel chains, restaurant groups, and retail companies that had committed to comprehensive discrimination monitoring as a competitive advantage rather than regulatory burden. Carmen Santos addressed questions from service industry workers who were concerned about increased monitoring affecting their job security. Respect Sky protects employees who treat customers with respect and provides documentation for employees who experience workplace discrimination from colleagues or supervisors. The platform creates safety for everyone who believes in dignity and accountability. Diana concluded the presentation with a personal reflection that connected her individual experience to the broader movement for institutional change. 3 weeks ago, I was humiliated on my own aircraft by my own employees. Tonight, we're launching technology that will ensure no one else experiences that humiliation in any service setting. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about prevention. And prevention begins with making discrimination impossible to hide. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but Diana understood that applause was less important than implementation. Respect Sky would succeed or fail based on its ability to prevent discrimination rather than its ability to generate enthusiasm. As the audience dispersed to begin implementation in their own organizations, Diana remained on stage to answer individual questions from civil rights leaders, federal investigators, and business executives who understood that comprehensive change required sustained effort rather than symbolic gestures. The platform was live, the monitoring approaches were active, and the accountability measures were in place. What remained was the daily work of ensuring that dignity and respect became practical realities rather than aspirational goals. 6 months after the Christmas Eve incident, the impact of Diana's experience and the Respect Sky platform had spread far beyond aviation to influence discrimination monitoring across industries that few people had anticipated. Dr. Sarah Williams, director of civil rights research at Georgetown University, published a comprehensive study documenting how real-time discrimination monitoring was reshaping corporate behavior across 12 different sectors. The Rodriguez-Blake effect, as civil rights researchers had begun calling the phenomenon, demonstrated how individual incidents of discrimination could become catalysts for comprehensive institutional change when supported by technology, legal accountability, and sustained public attention. Congressional hearings led by Representative Maria Gonzalez resulted in federal legislation requiring discrimination monitoring in all federally regulated transportation services. The Passenger Dignity Act, signed into law 4 months after Diana's flight, mandated real-time discrimination reporting and immediate federal intervention for civil rights violations in aviation, railbus, and cruise ship operations. But the most surprising impact occurred in industries that had never anticipated needing discrimination monitoring. Major restaurant chains, retail companies, healthcare organizations, and financial institutions voluntarily implemented Respect Sky monitoring after discovering that consumer preferences increasingly favored businesses that could demonstrate commitment to treating all customers with dignity. Maya Rodriguez, Director of Consumer Research at the National Retail Federation, presented data showing that 73% of consumers actively chose businesses that participated in discrimination monitoring programs, even when those businesses charged slightly higher prices than competitors who didn't demonstrate similar accountability commitments. Consumers are voting with their wallets for dignity and respect, Maya explained during a presentation at the National Business Ethics Conference. The Rodriguez-Blake incident showed people that discrimination in luxury service industries was widespread, and now consumers are demanding proof that businesses treat all customers equally, regardless of appearance or assumed economic status. The financial impact on companies that had resisted discrimination monitoring was swift and severe. 3 major hotel chains experienced significant revenue decreases after social media campaigns highlighted their refusal to implement guest dignity programs. 2 restaurant groups faced consumer boycotts that forced implementation of comprehensive staff training and real-time discrimination reporting. Carmen Santos, now serving as National Director of Customer Advocacy for Apex Global Industries, managed training programs that had been adopted by over 200 companies across 8 industries. Her experience during the Christmas Eve incident had become a case study in employee advocacy and ethical courage that was taught in business schools and customer service programs nationwide. The most important lesson from our experience, Carmen told a conference of hospitality industry executives, is that employees want to do the right thing when they feel safe to do so. Discrimination monitoring protects customers and employees by making retaliation against ethical behavior more dangerous than allowing discrimination to continue. Federal Aviation Administration reforms extended beyond passenger treatment to include comprehensive crew training, incident reporting requirements, and regular audits that made discriminatory behavior practically impossible in commercial and private aviation. Captain Trevor McKenzie's case became a cautionary tale taught in pilot training programs as an example of how individual prejudice could destroy careers and expose companies to federal prosecution. The aviation industry's adoption of comprehensive discrimination monitoring influenced similar changes in other transportation sectors. Amtrak implemented passenger dignity programs across all routes. Major bus companies adopted real-time discrimination reporting. Cruise lines established guest advocacy approaches that prevented discriminatory treatment in dining, entertainment, and service settings. Dr. Mitchell, leading Apex Global's legal team, presented research at the American Bar Association conference showing how real-time discrimination monitoring had reduced civil rights litigation by 67% across participating industries. When discrimination becomes impossible to hide and consequences become immediate, discriminatory behavior decreases dramatically. Prevention is more effective than punishment for addressing civil rights violations. International adoption of discrimination monitoring platforms exceeded all projections as companies operating in multiple countries discovered that comprehensive civil rights accountability provided competitive advantages in global markets. European airlines, Asian hotel chains, and Australian retail companies implemented Respect Sky monitoring to demonstrate commitment to treating international customers with dignity, regardless of cultural background or appearance. Marcus Thompson's continued social media coverage of implementation results reached over 50 million followers who tracked progress across multiple industries. His documentation showed discrimination incidents decreasing from hundreds per week to dozens per month, as monitoring approaches made discriminatory behavior too risky for most businesses to attempt. The Rodriguez-Blake effect proves that individual courage combined with technological accountability can reshape entire industries, Marcus told his followers during a live stream from an airport where Respect Sky monitoring had eliminated discriminatory passenger treatment. One woman's refusal to accept discrimination has protected millions of people who will never know her name. The economic impact extended beyond individual companies to influence investor decisions and corporate valuation. Environmental, social, and governance investment funds began requiring discrimination monitoring as a condition for investment. Companies that could demonstrate comprehensive civil rights accountability received preferential lending terms and higher stock valuations than competitors that couldn't provide similar documentation. Diana's monthly reports to federal investigators showed continuous improvement in passenger treatment across all Apex global operations. 0 discrimination incidents had been recorded in charter aviation services for 3 consecutive months. Customer satisfaction ratings reached all-time highs as passengers experienced service that prioritized dignity and respect, regardless of appearance or assumptions about economic status. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was invisible to statistics and difficult to measure in economic terms. Millions of people who had experienced discrimination in service settings now traveled, dined, and shopped with confidence that discriminatory treatment would be immediately addressed rather than ignored or covered up. The platform had achieved something that legislation alone could not accomplish. It had made respect more profitable than prejudice and dignity more valuable than discrimination. 1 year after the Christmas Eve incident, Diana Rodriguez-Blake returned to Aspen for the first time since her experience with Captain McKenzie and the Whitfields. This time, she flew on the same aircraft tail number N11127DR with a crew that had completed comprehensive discrimination awareness training and understood that passenger dignity was not negotiable under any circumstances. The flight attendant, Maria Santos Carmen's younger sister, who had been inspired by Carmen's advocacy to join the aviation industry, greeted every passenger with the same respect regardless of their appearance or seating assignment. The captain, Patricia Williams, a former Air Force officer who had been personally selected by Diana to lead the Charter Division's New Culture Initiative, conducted pre-flight safety briefings that explicitly welcomed all passengers as valued travelers worthy of professional service. But the most significant difference was invisible to casual observation. Throughout the aircraft, discrete monitoring approaches captured audio and video that was transmitted in real time to Respect Sky servers, ensuring that any hint of discriminatory treatment would be immediately detected and addressed. The technology that had been developed in response to Diana's humiliation now protected every passenger on every flight without requiring their active participation or awareness. Diana spent the flight reviewing financial reports that showed the long-term impact of comprehensive civil rights accountability on corporate performance. Apex Global's reputation for passenger dignity had become a competitive advantage that attracted high-profile clients and generated premium pricing that more than offset the costs of monitoring approaches and training programs. The personal costs of pursuing justice had been significant, but ultimately worthwhile. Diana had spent months testifying before federal investigators, congressional committees, and civil rights organizations. She had endured media scrutiny that examined every aspect of her personal and professional life. She had invested millions of dollars in technology development and institutional reform that could have been used for business expansion or personal luxury. But the personal rewards exceeded any financial calculations. Diana had received thousands of letters from people who had experienced discrimination and found courage in her refusal to accept humiliation quietly. Flight attendants, hotel clerks, restaurant servers, and retail workers across multiple industries had contacted her to describe how Respect Sky monitoring had protected them from customers and supervisors who had previously felt free to engage in discriminatory behavior without consequences. Carmen Santos had become more than an employee. She had become a colleague and friend whose integrity during the original incident had demonstrated the kind of character Diana valued above any professional qualification. Carmen's promotion to National Director of Customer Advocacy had inspired hundreds of customer service workers to report discrimination they had previously been afraid to document. The Whitfields had disappeared from public view after pleading guilty to federal civil rights violations and paying substantial fines for their discriminatory demands during the flight. Derek's investment banking career had ended permanently, and Miranda faced ongoing civil lawsuits from passengers who had experienced discrimination during other charter flights where her behavior had been recorded by crew members afraid to intervene directly. Captain Trevor McKenzie had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for civil rights violations and aviation safety threats. His pilot's license had been permanently revoked, and he faced lifetime prohibition from employment in any transportation industry. But perhaps more importantly, his case had become required study material for aviation professionals, ensuring that future pilots understood the legal and professional consequences of discriminatory passenger treatment. Jake Morrison had been promoted to Chief of Aviation Safety and Ethics, where he developed training programs that taught crew members to recognize and report discrimination before it escalated to the level Diana had experienced. His willingness to document Trevor's behavior had provided crucial evidence for federal prosecution and had inspired other aviation professionals to prioritize passenger dignity over crew hierarchy. Diana's family Christmas celebration in Aspen included relatives who had traveled from across the country to honor her courage and celebrate the institutional changes that had resulted from her refusal to accept discrimination quietly. Her mother, whose advice about giving people rope to hang themselves had proven prophetic, expressed pride that her daughter had used power responsibly to protect people who lacked the resources to protect themselves. The broader impact extended beyond individual justice to influence cultural conversations about discrimination that had previously been ignored or dismissed. High school students studied Diana's experience in civics classes focused on civil rights and corporate accountability. Business schools included her case in ethics curricula that examined the relationship between individual courage and institutional change. But Diana's most treasured reward was a letter from an 11-year-old girl named Ashley Williams, whose family had experienced discrimination at a luxury resort that had since implemented comprehensive dignity monitoring. Ashley wrote, "Thank you for making it safe for people like me to travel with my family without being afraid that someone will tell us we don't belong somewhere. Because of you, my parents don't have to worry about teaching me to be smaller, so other people will be more comfortable." That letter captured the ultimate purpose of Diana's response to discrimination, ensuring that future generations would inherit service industries where dignity and respect were practical realities rather than aspirational goals. As the aircraft descended toward Aspen, Diana looked out the window at mountains that had witnessed her humiliation exactly 1 year earlier. This time she traveled as a passenger whose dignity was protected by approaches that made discrimination practically impossible and financially catastrophic for anyone who attempted it. The circle was complete, but the work continued. Respect was an ongoing commitment, not a single achievement, and Diana understood that justice required sustained vigilance rather than momentary victory. 18 months after the Christmas Eve incident, the Federal Aviation Administration published its annual Civil Rights Compliance Report, documenting a 94% reduction in passenger discrimination complaints across all aviation sectors. The report credited comprehensive monitoring approaches, mandatory crew training programs, and real-time accountability measures that had transformed how passengers were treated regardless of their appearance or assumed economic status. Diana Rodriguez Blake had been invited to testify before the Senate Transportation Committee about the industry-wide changes that had resulted from her experience and the Respect Sky platform implementation. The hearing room was packed with civil rights leaders, aviation industry executives, and passengers who had benefited from the discrimination monitoring approaches that were now standard across major transportation companies. Senators Diana began addressing the bipartisan committee that had requested her testimony 18 months ago. I was threatened with arrest for sitting in first class on my own aircraft because someone decided I didn't look like I belonged there. Today, I'm here to report that discrimination monitoring has made such treatment practically impossible across the aviation industry. Committee Chair Senator Elizabeth Warren consulted data showing the financial impact of comprehensive civil rights accountability on airline profitability and customer satisfaction. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake. The preliminary data suggests that discrimination monitoring has actually improved customer satisfaction and increased profitability for participating companies. Can you explain how civil rights compliance became a competitive advantage rather than a regulatory burden? Diana's response reflected months of studying implementation results across hundreds of companies. Senator Warren, discrimination is expensive. It drives away customers, creates legal liability, generates negative publicity, and destroys employee morale. When companies eliminate discrimination, they improve service quality for everyone, while reducing costs associated with complaints, litigation, and reputation management. Ranking Member Senator Marco Rubio addressed concerns from aviation industry representatives about the costs of monitoring approaches and training programs. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake industry groups have argued that comprehensive discrimination monitoring creates operational burdens and regulatory compliance costs that could affect service quality and pricing. How do you respond to these concerns? Senator Rubio Diana replied. The cost of preventing discrimination is significantly lower than the cost of allowing discrimination to occur. Companies that have implemented monitoring approaches report reduced liability insurance costs, decreased legal expenses, increased customer retention, and improved employee productivity that more than offset monitoring and training investments. Carmen Santos, now serving as Assistant Administrator for Passenger Rights at the Federal Aviation Administration, presented data showing the impact of real-time discrimination monitoring on employee behavior and customer experience. Senators' crew members report feeling more confident in their ability to provide excellent service when they know that discriminatory behavior will be immediately detected and addressed. Customers report feeling more comfortable and confident when they travel, knowing that any mistreatment will be documented and resolved immediately. The testimony included video evidence from Marcus Thompson, whose social media coverage had reached over 100 million viewers and documented discrimination prevention across multiple industries. His presentation showed before and after footage from airports, hotels, restaurants, and retail establishments that demonstrated how monitoring approaches had changed customer interactions. The Rodriguez-Blake effect has proven that individual courage combined with technological accountability can reshape entire industries, Marcus told the committee via video conference from an airport where he was documenting discrimination prevention programs. One woman's refusal to accept discrimination has protected millions of travelers who will never know her name. International adoption data presented by Dr. Mitchell showed that discrimination monitoring had become a global standard for luxury service industries, with companies in 34 countries implementing Respect Sky-compatible approaches to demonstrate commitment to treating all customers with dignity, regardless of cultural background or appearance. The platform has created international accountability standards that protect travelers, workers, and businesses by making discrimination too risky and too expensive to attempt, Dr. Mitchell testified. Countries with comprehensive monitoring approaches report increased tourism revenue, improved international business relationships, and enhanced global reputation for fair treatment of visitors. Senator Warren addressed the long-term implications of discrimination monitoring for federal policy and regulatory oversight. Ms. Rodriguez-Blake, Do you believe that real-time civil rights monitoring should be expanded beyond transportation to other federally regulated industries? Diana's response reflected her understanding that comprehensive change required sustained commitment rather than limited implementation. Senator discrimination doesn't recognize industry boundaries. If monitoring approaches can prevent discrimination in aviation, they can prevent discrimination in healthcare, banking, housing, education, and employment. The technology exists, the legal framework is established, and the public support is overwhelming. The committee's final questions addressed the personal cost of pursuing institutional change, and whether individual victims of discrimination should be expected to bear the burden of fighting for comprehensive accountability. Diana's response captured the philosophy that had guided her entire approach to the incident and its aftermath. Senators, I didn't choose to experience discrimination, but I did choose how to respond to discrimination. Individual courage can inspire institutional change, but institutional change requires sustained commitment from leaders who have the power to make discrimination impossible rather than just illegal. Committee Chair Warren concluded the hearing with observations about the broader implications of the Rodriguez-Blake case for civil rights enforcement and corporate accountability. This case demonstrates that individual acts of courage supported by technology and sustained by institutional commitment can achieve more comprehensive change than years of traditional civil rights litigation. As Diana left the hearing room, she was approached by a young black woman wearing a flight attendant uniform, who thanked her for making it possible to work in aviation without fear of discriminatory treatment from passengers or crew members. The woman's words reminded Diana that justice was measured not by headlines or legislation, but by individual experiences of dignity and respect that would never make the news. The work continued, but the standard had been established. Discrimination was no longer a cost of doing business, but a choice that carried immediate, visible, and financially catastrophic consequences for anyone who made it. 2 years after the Christmas Eve incident, the human cost of Diana's experience had been measured not only in changed policies and federal legislation, but in the individual lives that had been protected from discrimination by the accountability approaches that emerged from her refusal to accept humiliation quietly. Trevor McKenzie sat in a minimum security federal prison in Colorado, where he served as a cautionary example for other inmates who had lost careers due to discriminatory behavior. His case had become required reading in criminal justice programs focused on civil rights violations, and his recorded statements from the flight were used in training programs to demonstrate how prejudice could escalate to federal crimes. But Trevor's punishment extended beyond prison time. His pilot's license had been permanently revoked, ending a career that had taken decades to build. His name appeared in federal databases that prohibited employment in transportation industries. Most devastatingly, his family had been forced to relocate after media coverage made their hometown residence untenable due to public recognition and social ostracism. Trevor's wife, Linda McKenzie, had filed for divorce 6 months after his conviction, citing her inability to reconcile the man she had married with the person whose discriminatory behavior had been broadcast to millions of people. Their adult children had changed their surnames and relocated to different states to escape association with their father's federal conviction. The Whitfields had faced different but equally comprehensive consequences for their discriminatory demands during the flight. Derek's conviction for civil rights violations had ended his investment banking career permanently and resulted in professional licensing revocations that prevented employment in financial services. The couple had been forced to sell their Connecticut home to pay legal fees and federal fines. Miranda Whitfield had become the subject of multiple civil lawsuits filed by passengers who had experienced discrimination during other charter flights where her behavior had been documented by crew members using internal reporting approaches. Her social media accounts, once filled with luxury travel photography, had been deleted after becoming targets for public criticism about entitled behavior and discriminatory attitudes. But perhaps more significantly, The Whitfields had been required to participate in federal diversity education programs as part of their sentencing, exposing them to perspectives and experiences that challenged the assumptions underlying their discriminatory worldview. Miranda's required community service at civil rights organizations had forced her to confront the real-world impact of the prejudices she had expressed so casually during the flight. Jake Morrison had built a new career as Director of Aviation Ethics and Safety, where he developed training programs that taught crew members to prioritize passenger dignity over hierarchical authority. His willingness to document Trevor's discriminatory behavior had provided crucial evidence for federal prosecution and had inspired aviation professionals across the industry to speak up against discriminatory treatment. Jake's personal transformation included intensive education about civil rights history and contemporary discrimination issues that helped him understand how his silence during previous incidents had enabled discriminatory behavior to continue unchallenged. His new role included speaking at aviation conferences about the professional and legal obligations of crew members to protect passengers from discrimination. Carmen Santos had become a national advocate for service industry workers, using her experience during the Christmas Eve incident to demonstrate how employees could maintain professional integrity while protecting customers from discriminatory treatment. Her promotion to Executive Director of Customer Rights at Apex Global Industries had inspired customer service workers across multiple industries to report discrimination they had previously been afraid to document. Carmen's speaking engagements at universities and professional conferences reached thousands of workers who learned from her example that ethical courage could be professionally rewarded rather than professionally punished when supported by proper accountability approaches. Her story had become a case study in business ethics courses that examined the relationship between individual integrity and institutional change. Dr. Mitchell had expanded his legal practice to include civil rights advocacy, representing victims of discrimination across multiple industries while helping companies implement monitoring approaches that prevented discriminatory treatment. His work on the Rodriguez-Blake case had established legal precedents that made real-time discrimination documentation admissible in federal court and created frameworks for immediate intervention in civil rights violations. Elena Rodriguez had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer of Apex Global Industries, where she oversaw implementation of dignity and respect protocols across all company operations. Her coordination of the response to Diana's incident had demonstrated crisis management skills that attracted recognition from business leadership programs and crisis communication experts. But the most meaningful human impact was documented in letters, emails, and social media posts from thousands of individuals who had experienced improved treatment in service settings due to monitoring approaches that made discrimination too risky for businesses to attempt. Parents wrote about traveling with their children without fear of humiliation. Elderly passengers described air travel experiences where their dignity was respected regardless of mobility limitations. Young professionals reported hotel and restaurant experiences where their appearance didn't determine their treatment. Marcus Thompson had built his social media following to over 10 million users by documenting discrimination prevention across industries. But his most powerful content featured individuals who shared personal stories about experiencing dignity and respect in settings where they had previously faced discriminatory treatment. Diana received hundreds of personal messages from people whose lives had been improved by the accountability approaches that emerged from her experience. A teenage girl thanked her for making it safe to fly to college interviews without worrying about discriminatory treatment. An elderly man expressed gratitude for hotel experiences where his dignity was respected despite mobility limitations. A young mother described restaurant experiences where her children were treated with kindness regardless of their family's appearance or economic status. These personal stories reminded Diana that justice was ultimately measured not by corporate policy changes or federal legislation, but by individual experiences of dignity and respect that had been protected by approaches designed to make discrimination impossible rather than just illegal. The human cost of discrimination had been high, But the human benefit of accountability had been immeasurable in its impact on millions of lives that would be forever protected from the kind of humiliation Diana had experienced on Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve, 2 years after the incident that had changed everything, Diana Rodriguez Blake stood in the same private aviation terminal at Teterboro Airport where her journey toward justice had begun. This time, she wasn't alone. Carmen Santos stood beside her as Executive Director of Customer Rights Marcus Thompson documented the moment for his 15 million social media followers, and Elena Rodriguez coordinated with a crew that understood dignity and respect as non-negotiable professional standards. The same aircraft tail number N1127DR waited on the tarmac, but everything else had transformed. The crew had completed comprehensive civil rights training that emphasized passenger dignity regardless of appearance or assumptions. Real-time monitoring approaches ensured that any hint of discriminatory treatment would be immediately detected and addressed. Most importantly, the culture of aviation had changed from one where discrimination was quietly tolerated to one where discrimination was professionally and legally impossible. 2 years ago tonight, Diana said, addressing the small group of colleagues and advocates who had gathered to commemorate the anniversary, "I was told to move to the back of a plane I owned because someone decided I didn't look like I belonged in first class." Tonight, discrimination monitoring approaches protect millions of passengers who will never know they needed protection. She paused, looking out at the aircraft where her humiliation had been transformed into accountability approaches that had influenced civil rights enforcement across multiple industries. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about prevention. It's about ensuring that tomorrow looks different from yesterday. It's about using power responsibly to protect people who lack the resources to protect themselves. Carmen Santos stepped forward, her voice carrying the confidence that had grown from 2 years of advocating for customer dignity across industries. Ms. Rodriguez Blake, before I met you, I thought that discrimination was something I had to accept quietly if I wanted to keep my job. Your courage taught me that maintaining professional integrity requires speaking up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Marcus Thompson addressed his live stream audience, which included millions of viewers who had followed the Rodriguez Blake story from viral incident to comprehensive institutional change. 2 years ago, we witnessed discrimination that was considered normal in luxury service industries. Today, we're standing in an airport where discrimination has become practically impossible because accountability approaches make it too expensive and too risky for anyone to attempt. The assembled group included representatives from civil rights organizations, federal investigators, aviation industry executives, and individuals who had experienced discrimination in service settings before monitoring approaches made such treatment professionally and financially catastrophic. Diana addressed the broader audience through Marcus's live stream, understanding that her words would reach millions of people who had experienced discrimination in their own lives. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, if you've ever been treated as less than human because of your appearance or your assumptions about your background, know this: your dignity is not negotiable. Your worth is not determined by other people's prejudices, and when you stand up for yourself, you stand up for everyone who comes after you. She moved toward the aircraft where Captain Patricia Williams waited with a crew that had been selected not just for professional qualifications but for demonstrated commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. Character isn't revealed by how we treat people who can help us. Diana continued. Character is revealed by how we treat people who can do nothing for us. When we witness discrimination, silence makes us complicit. When we experience discrimination, acceptance makes us enablers. Change begins with courage, but courage must be sustained by approaches that make justice practical rather than just aspirational. As the group boarded the aircraft, the difference from 2 years earlier was immediately apparent. Every passenger was greeted with the same respect regardless of their appearance. Every seat assignment was honored without question about appropriateness or belonging. Every interaction was conducted with the understanding that dignity was a right, not a privilege to be earned through appearance or assumptions about economic status. Diana took her seat in 1A, the same seat where she had been told she didn't belong, and reflected on the journey from individual humiliation to institutional transformation. The personal cost had been significant months of testimony, media scrutiny, and investment in accountability approaches that could have been used for business expansion or personal luxury. But the personal rewards were immeasurable. Diana had received thousands of letters from people who had experienced improved treatment in service settings due to monitoring approaches that made discrimination too dangerous for businesses to attempt. Flight attendants, hotel clerks, restaurant servers, and retail workers had contacted her to describe how accountability approaches had protected them from discriminatory treatment by customers and supervisors. As the aircraft lifted off toward Aspen, Diana looked out at lights that stretched across the landscape below. Each light represented a family, a business, a community where the principles of dignity and respect had been strengthened by accountability approaches that made discrimination impossible rather than just illegal. The conversation in the cabin focused not on past injustices, but on future possibilities. Carmen discussed expansion of customer advocacy programs to healthcare and education industries. Marcus shared data showing continued decreases in discrimination complaints across all monitored sectors. Elena reported on international adoption of monitoring approaches that were creating global standards for dignified treatment of all customers. But Diana's attention was drawn to a message on her smartwatch from Ashley Williams, the 11-year-old girl who had written to thank her for making travel safe for children who looked different from traditional expectations. Ashley was now 13, and her message included a photo of her family boarding a plane for their Christmas vacation, confident that their dignity would be respected regardless of their appearance or background. "Thank you for making it possible for me to travel without being afraid," Ashley had written. "Because of you, I know that my worth isn't determined by other people's prejudices, and my dreams aren't limited by other people's expectations." That message captured the ultimate purpose of Diana's response to discrimination, ensuring that future generations would inherit service industries where dignity and respect were practical realities rather than aspirational goals. As the aircraft cruised toward Aspen through clear skies that contrasted sharply with the blizzard that had accompanied her original journey, Diana understood that justice was not a destination, but a direction. The work of ensuring dignity and respect would continue for as long as people needed protection from prejudice and discrimination. But tonight, on Christmas Eve, millions of passengers would travel with confidence that their dignity was protected by approaches that made discrimination impossible rather than just illegal. Tomorrow, they would wake up in a world where character was measured by how people treated those who could do nothing for them. And forever, they would benefit from the accountability that emerged when one woman refused to accept humiliation quietly and chose instead to transform institutional culture through sustained courage and comprehensive change. The measure of justice wasn't found in punishment, but in prevention, not in revenge, but in protection, not in personal satisfaction, but in public safety for everyone who would never experience discrimination because someone else had the courage to ensure that dignity became more profitable than prejudice. 5 years after the Christmas Eve incident that transformed aviation civil rights enforcement, the lives of everyone involved had been permanently altered by the accountability approaches that emerged from Diana Rodriguez Blake's refusal to accept discrimination quietly. Diana had expanded Respect Sky monitoring to cover healthcare, education, housing, and employment sectors, creating comprehensive civil rights protection across industries that affected every aspect of daily life. Her company, Apex Global Industries, had become the international standard for diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, with organizations worldwide implementing monitoring approaches to demonstrate commitment to treating all people with dignity, regardless of appearance or background. She continued to serve on federal advisory committees that shaped civil rights policy and spoke regularly at international conferences about using business success responsibly to protect vulnerable populations. Carmen Santos had been promoted to Federal Administrator for Customer Rights, where she oversaw implementation of discrimination monitoring across all federally regulated service industries. Her testimony before congressional committees influenced legislation that expanded civil rights protection to include real-time accountability measures and immediate intervention protocols. She had become a national advocate for service industry workers, using her platform to ensure that employees felt safe reporting discrimination without fear of professional retaliation. Marcus Thompson had transformed his social media platform into a comprehensive civil rights advocacy organization that reached over 50 million followers across multiple platforms. His documentation of discrimination prevention programs had influenced corporate policies across dozens of industries, and his annual Dignity Report provided accountability metrics that investors used to evaluate company commitment to civil rights compliance. He had been recognized by civil rights organizations as one of the most effective advocates for institutional change through digital activism. Trevor McKenzie had been released from federal prison after serving 18 months for civil rights violations, but his conviction had permanently ended his career in aviation and transportation industries. He worked in a warehouse in rural Colorado, far from the aviation industry, where his discriminatory behavior had cost him everything he had spent decades building. His case continued to be studied in criminal justice and business ethics programs as an example of how individual prejudice could escalate to federal crimes with devastating personal and professional consequences. The Whitfields had divorced 6 months after their conviction for civil rights violations, with Derek working in retail sales and Miranda employed at a call center in a different state. Their social media presence had been permanently deleted after becoming targets for public criticism about discriminatory behavior in luxury service settings. They had been required to complete community service at civil rights organizations as part of their federal sentencing, exposing them to perspectives that challenged the prejudices underlying their discriminatory worldview. Jake Morrison had been promoted to National Director of Aviation Ethics, where he developed training programs that taught crew members to prioritize passenger dignity over hierarchical authority. His willingness to document Trevor's discriminatory behavior had provided crucial evidence for federal prosecution and had inspired aviation professionals to speak up against discriminatory treatment. He regularly addressed industry conferences about professional obligations to protect passengers from discrimination. Elena Rodriguez served as Chief Operating Officer of Apex Global Industries, overseeing dignity and respect protocols across all company operations in 47 countries. Her crisis management during the original incident had demonstrated leadership skills that attracted recognition from international business organizations, and she had become a sought-after consultant for companies implementing comprehensive civil rights accountability approaches. Dr. Mitchell had established a civil rights law practice that specialized in real-time discrimination monitoring and federal compliance approaches. His legal work on the Rodriguez-Blake case had created precedents for immediate intervention in civil rights violations and established frameworks for comprehensive accountability that had been adopted by companies worldwide. The Rodriguez-Blake effect had influenced civil rights enforcement and corporate accountability practices across 34 countries, with international adoption of discrimination monitoring, creating global standards for dignified treatment of customers, employees, and service recipients. The European Union had implemented comprehensive monitoring requirements for transportation, hospitality, and healthcare industries, citing the success of real-time accountability approaches in reducing discrimination complaints while improving customer satisfaction. Corporate culture across multiple industries had fundamentally shifted from tolerance of discrimination to active prevention of discriminatory behavior. Fortune 500 companies reported that discrimination monitoring had improved employee morale, reduced legal liability, and increased customer retention, while creating competitive advantages that attracted socially conscious consumers and investors. The business case for civil rights compliance had been proven through data showing that dignity and respect were more profitable than prejudice and discrimination. Educational institutions worldwide used the Rodriguez-Blake case in business ethics, civil rights law, and social justice curricula that examined the relationship between individual courage and institutional change. High school students studied Diana's experience as an example of how refusing to accept discrimination quietly could inspire comprehensive accountability approaches that protected millions of people from similar treatment. Federal legislation inspired by the incident had expanded beyond aviation to require discrimination monitoring in healthcare, banking, housing, and employment sectors. The Passenger Dignity Act had been followed by comprehensive civil rights legislation that created real-time accountability for discriminatory treatment across all federally regulated industries. Congressional representatives regularly cited the Rodriguez-Blake case when advocating for expanded civil rights protection and immediate intervention protocols. International human rights organizations had adopted Respect Sky monitoring as a standard for evaluating country commitment to civil rights protection, with governments worldwide implementing accountability approaches to demonstrate progress on discrimination prevention. The platform had become a diplomatic tool for measuring international cooperation on civil rights issues, and had influenced trade agreements that included human dignity protections as economic cooperation requirements. Diana Rodriguez-Blake stood before the National Civil Rights Museum on Christmas Eve, 5 years after the incident that had changed her life and influenced civil rights enforcement across multiple industries. The annual commemoration had become a tradition that attracted civil rights leaders, federal officials, and individuals whose lives had been improved by accountability approaches that made discrimination too expensive and too risky for businesses to attempt. 5 years ago tonight, Diana told the assembled crowd, which included thousands of attendees and millions of live stream viewers, I was humiliated on my own aircraft by my own employees. Tonight, discrimination monitoring protects millions of people who will never know they needed protection, and dignity has become more profitable than prejudice across industries that affect every aspect of daily life. Her words reached a global audience that included passengers traveling confidently in transportation approaches where their dignity was protected, patients receiving health care where their appearance didn't determine their treatment, students attending schools where their background didn't limit their opportunities, and workers employed by companies where discrimination was professionally and financially impossible. Justice begins with refusing to accept injustice quietly. Diana continued. But justice is sustained by building approaches that make injustice impossible rather than just illegal. When we witness discrimination, we have a moral obligation to document it, report it, and ensure that accountability approaches prevent similar treatment of other people. The audience included representatives from civil rights organizations, federal investigators, corporate executives, and individuals whose lives had been protected by monitoring approaches that emerged from one woman's refusal to accept humiliation as a cost of air travel. The measure of our humanity is found in how we treat people who can do nothing for us, Diana concluded. When we protect the vulnerable, defend the marginalized, and ensure dignity for everyone regardless of their appearance or background, we create a society where everyone's children can travel safely, work confidently, and dream without limits. As the ceremony concluded and attendees dispersed to continue the work of ensuring justice and accountability across multiple sectors, Diana reflected on the journey from individual discrimination to institutional transformation. The personal cost had been significant, but the public benefit had been immeasurable in its impact on millions of lives forever protected from the kind of treatment she had experienced. Dignity was not negotiable. Respect was not optional. And accountability would continue to ensure that tomorrow looked different from yesterday for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong somewhere simply because of how they looked or where others assumed they came from. If this story moved you, I want to ask you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button to help this video reach more people who need to hear this message. Stories like Diana's don't spread by accident. They spread because people like you choose to share them. Second, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories about courage, justice, and people who refuse to accept discrimination quietly. And third, share this video with someone who needs to know that their dignity matters, their worth isn't determined by other people's prejudices, and that standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who comes after you. In the comments below, tell me about a time when you witnessed discrimination, or when someone stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And together we can build a world where everyone's children can travel safely, work confidently, and dream without limits. Remember, justice begins with refusing to accept injustice quietly. Character is revealed by how we treat people who can do nothing for us. And sometimes one person's courage to say no to discrimination can change entire industries and protect millions of people who will never know their names. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being part of the change this world needs. Until next time, keep standing up, keep speaking out, and never forget that dignity is not negotiable.